Chapter 225. 7 days passed in a blink of an eye in the purification cell. The Ryan family's carriage was already waiting for Dudian on the street. The coachman was Barton. "Your hand." Barton's face changed as he saw Dean. He noticed that Dean's arm was wrapped in bandages and hung in front of his chest. Dudian said, "Let's go back and talk about it." After he sat down, Barton raised his horsewhip and slapped it, and the carriage slowly drove away. Dudian sat in the carriage after leaving the town. "Did anything happen to the Ryan family while I was away from the giant wall?" Barton shook the whip and whispered, "No. It was the same as usual. The day after you left, old Foulin called his third son Sandro to his room. He dismissed all the servants. I don't know what they were discussing." Dudien's eyes lit up as he nodded. "When you came back, Patriarch Foulin was very happy to hear about you," Barton added. Dudian nodded and didn't say anything. A moment later, the carriage arrived at the border fortress. The soldiers on duty checked the certificate and the hunter's medal issued by Shou Jing, and then let them go. A few hours later, they returned to the Ryan castle from the wilderness of Longsong's stronghold. Dudian got off the carriage and saw Patriarch Jake and his third son Sandro waiting at the door. There were also 2 people in the third generation. They were Hugh and Jake's daughter Pina. Pina was the daughter of Jake. She was the daughter of the third generation. Barton jumped off the carriage and trotted over to help Dudian. Dudian waved his hand to indicate that he didn't need to. He didn't want to move the bones in his left hand. At this time, old Foulin and others who were waiting at the door saw Dudian's injured arm. The smile on their faces changed as they quickly came to greet him. Sandro was worried that his father would fall. He carefully supported him all the way. "Mr. Dean, your arm." Jake, who was the first to run over, saw Dudian's bandaged left hand. He asked, "Is it serious? Will you be able to fight in the future?" Old Foulin frowned as he heard his words. "Bastard." Jake came to his senses and quickly said, "Mr. Dean, is your body important? Quickly go in and rest." Dean looked at him and said to old Foulin, "I'll trouble you to find a few good doctors to help me. My bones are broken." Old Foulin's face slightly changed. "I will take care of this. You go in and rest." He looked at Sander. "Hurry up and help Mr. Dean." Dean waved his hand to stop Sander and returned to the castle with old Foulin. They came to Dean's room on the 2nd floor. Old Foulin saw that it was getting late, so he dismissed them all. He looked at Dean, who was leaning against the wall, and asked, "Are you really injured?" Dean said, "Don't you think so?" Old Foulin's face slightly changed as he saw Dean admit it. He smiled. "If I knew it would be like this, then I wouldn't have rented this passage. The news of your injury will soon spread to the ears of other consortia. It will be a huge blow to our consortium," Dean said. "It's not that there are no benefits. At least they will despise us." Old Foulin smiled. "I'm just worried that your body will be injured. It will affect the future hunting." Dean said, "It won't. It's just my body that's injured. Even if my arm is crippled, I can still hunt monsters." Old Foulin didn't understand his words but didn't refute. "I'll find the best doctor for you. Don't be discouraged. Even if I spend all the money I have to cure you." "I'm not discouraged." Dean smiled. "My will won't surrender so easily." Old Foulin was relieved to see him smile. "What is the situation outside the passage?" "The danger factor is lower than what we thought," Dudian said. "After so many years, most of the monsters outside the passage have been eaten. Most of the terrifying monsters have left this place and migrated to other places with rich food. But I haven't gone deep yet. The situation is not optimistic. Maybe I will go deeper to explore after I become a senior hunter." Old Foulin nodded. He looked at Dean, who was lying in bed. "You are a few years younger than my grandson. It's really hard for you to support the entire consortium by yourself. If we have enough savings, then we can recruit a few hunters to assist you. To be an extraordinary person, you have to do extraordinary things first." Dean smiled. Don't forget our alchemy items. If we recruit other hunters, then it's inevitable that we will be exposed. Old Fuline sighed. Other consortia have hunting teams that act together. There is a clear division of labor. If you are alone, then it's inevitable that you won't be able to take care of things. I'll make do for the time being. Once we have enough savings, then I'll have a candidate, Dean said. Old Fuline looked at him. Will it be the 3 little guys that you brought? Of course not, Dean said. Their physique isn't suitable for fighting outside the giant wall. Moreover, we don't have time to awaken a wolf cub. I'll find a few real wolves when you have enough gold coins. Old Fuline was surprised. He didn't think that Dudian would have such connections. It seemed that his understanding of the boy was too little. He didn't continue to ask but said, As for money, we have about 12,000 gold coins in our hands. The new textile machines have been promoted in various places. Our textile factory has received very few orders. Now we can only rely on the monthly dividends of the Scott Consortium and your hunting. The total value of your hunting materials has been identified by the Temple of Element. The total value is 328 gold coins and 17 silver coins. It's a gratifying harvest for the first exploration. Dean asked, Can I take back the 4 cold crystals that I have hunted? Old Fuline shook his head. It's very difficult. Although the value of cold crystals is only 1 gold coin, but it's a forbidden item. Dean paid attention to his words. So, there is a way. Old Fuline helplessly said, As long as there is money, there will be a way. If you insist on it, then I can help you get 4 cold crystals. But you will need to pay a big price. You will need at least hundreds of gold coins to send 4 cold crystals. Dean immediately said, Then help me get them out. But it must be the 4 cold crystals that I have hunted. I have a way to identify the others. Make sure that the people inside don't fool me. Old Fuline was surprised. Are these cold crystals that important? Even if I have to spend 200 gold coins, I have to get them, Dean said. Old Fuline understood. All right, I will help you get them. Thank you. There is no need to thank me. The next day, Old Fuline called for a doctor and brought him upstairs to diagnose Dean. The doctor was a middle-aged man. He was accompanied by a gentle and delicate girl who was carrying his medical box. Hello, Mr. Dean. The middle-aged man introduced himself. He saw the gauze on Dean's arm. I need to take it off. If it hurts, please relax your body. Dean nodded and handed over his arm. Sorry to trouble you. The middle-aged man politely asked the girl to open the medical box. He took out a pair of scissors and cut the bandage. Dean's left hand was exposed. Chapter 226. Middle-aged doctor and Old Fuline didn't expect the injury to be so serious. Their faces slightly changed as they looked at Dudian. Their hearts were shocked as they thought of how Dudian had lifted his arm casually. What kind of willpower was that? The girl who was waiting for instructions in front of the medical box was shocked. She didn't expect that the teenager who was almost the same age as her would suffer such terrible pain. Her eyes couldn't help but reveal a bit of pity. Dudian felt her gaze and glanced at her. He looked at the middle-aged doctor. Can it be cured? Middle-aged doctor recovered and said, You have a fracture problem. I have to take a closer look. He reached out and gently touched Dudian's arm. He immediately felt the uneven and irregular hard bones under the flesh. It was as if there were countless stones piled up inside. His face changed as he looked at Dudian in shock. He immediately saw Dudian's calm eyes. His heart was even more shocked. But he was an adult after all. He quickly restrained his emotions. He said with lingering fear, Your bones are broken too seriously. If you want to cure it, it will be very difficult. Difficult is not a problem. There is hope. Dudian looked at him. Do you need to do surgery? Middle-aged doctor nodded. Yes, we need to peel off the skin of your arm to see the extent of your fracture. If there is no defect, then arrange it back to its original shape. If it is fixed, then recuperate for a few years. Perhaps there is a low hope for healing. Dudian nodded. In this era, such medical skills were quite brilliant. It was necessary to have a deep understanding of the human skeleton in order to reorder the broken bone. Then I will leave it to you, Dudian said. Okay, I will try my best to help you. Middle-aged doctor reached out to the girl. Bandage. The girl immediately handed it to him. He used a new bandage to wrap Dudien's arm again. He got up and said, Today is the first time I came here. I didn't bring enough tools. I will come back tomorrow. Go. Dudian nodded. Middle-aged doctor slightly bowed to Dudian and old Foulin. Then, accompanied by the housekeeper, he left with the girl's assistant. Your injury is so heavy. After the middle-aged doctor left, old Foulin looked at him. There are some painkillers in my room. I'll send them to you. No. Dean shook his head. Pain can make me stronger. He didn't want to tell old Foulin about the numbness in his left hand. He attached great importance to his physical condition and kept it a secret unless he was forced to. Old Foulin sighed as he looked at Dudien's calm eyes. I'll ask the butler to improve your meals. Have a good rest. Then he left the room. The next day, the middle-aged doctor came over with a large medical box to perform surgery on Dean. You can sleep for a while. This is the best anesthetic. It's long-lasting and you won't feel any pain. Middle-aged doctor said to Dudian. Although it was the second time they met, but Dudien's performance yesterday had left a deep impression on him. Dean said, You don't have to worry about me. I won't interfere with your operation. Middle-aged doctor didn't try to persuade him. He let the girl apply the anesthetic to Dean and started the operation. Through the surgery, it was discovered that the damage to the left hand was not only limited to the bones. These broken bones had also cut and punctured the blood vessels and meridians, causing the left hand to be almost necrotic. Halfway through the operation, the middle-aged doctor was so nervous that he was sweating profusely. First, he helped Dean arrange the broken fingertip-sized bones. According to the shape comparison, he put the bones back in place. Then he sutured the meridians and the main blood vessels. The operation lasted for 4 or 5 hours. Anesthetics were applied 4 times in the middle. Each time the effect was about 1 hour. In the afternoon, the operation was completely over. Dean's left hand was stitched up and fixed with 4 splints. The middle-aged doctor almost collapsed. He warned Dean, Don't touch water during the healing stage. Don't use force. If there is any uncomfortable reaction, inform me immediately. I'll come back once a week for a follow-up. Thank you. After the middle-aged doctor left, old Foulin came into the room. How do you feel? Do you feel better? Dean smiled. How can it be so fast? Is there any news about us in today's newspaper? Look at you. You are still concerned about this matter. Old Foulin looked at him. As expected, the other consortiums have learned about your injury. Moreover, it has been published in the Hunters newspaper. You are a little famous in the Hunters circle. But it's not a good name, Dean said. Let me have a look. Old Foulin ordered the butler outside. After a moment, a few newspapers were handed over. Dean picked up one of the newspapers and saw some familiar words. Green Consortium has hunted an unknown monster. According to the assessment of the Temple of Elements, the monster's bone marrow contains extremely high fat content. It can be made into a portable torch for exploration. Melon Consortium's Area Number 6 has been completely cleaned up. There may be a lot of money in the short term. Scott Consortium has lost 3 official primary hunters in the cleanup of Area Number 7. They have hunted a rare monster called Corruptor. They haven't decided whether to sell their magic marks. Dean looked through the news. Corruptor was ranked in the top 30 of the Monster Atlas. According to the assessment of the inner wall, the monsters were divided into 3 levels: ordinary, rare, and rare. Above the rare ones were the 8 legendary monsters. In the more than 200 years of history of the hunter profession, the 8 legendary monsters had appeared one after another. It was a rare encounter for decades. The number of hunters who had obtained the 8 legendary monsters could be counted on one's fingers. In total, there were no more than 5 people. The most recent hunter who had obtained the 8 legendary monsters was 30 years ago. He came from the Noel Consortium. At that time, the Noel Consortium was pushed to the first place among the many consortiums. However, the legendary hunter had fallen outside the giant wall. His body wasn't found. Since then, the Noel Consortium's economy had declined. Now it was only ranked 3rd among the consortiums. Corruptor's magic marks are at the same level as a ghoul. Dean's mouth slightly moved. It was a luxury to use a rare monster as a material to stimulate the magic marks. New World Consortium rented the Death Passage. They sent an intermediate hunter to explore the way. They have returned. It is reported that the hunter's arm was seriously injured. The harvest was low. Dean turned to the bottom and saw the news about himself. It occupied a relatively large space. He knew that it wasn't because of the New World Consortium, but because of the existence of the Death Passage. Chapter 227. Master. At this time, the butler gently knocked on the door. Come in. Old Foulin turned to look at the middle-aged butler. What's the matter? Master, Mr. John is waiting for you in the hall. The middle-aged butler bowed. Old Foulin was startled for a moment but nodded. I'll go down. He told Dudien to take care of his body. Then he let the butler help him to leave. After reading the hunter's newspaper, Dean continued to read other newspapers. He found out that his new textile machine had spread to various regions due to the competition between the 2 giants, Scott Consortium and Mellon Consortium. In this era of communication congestion, he was able to have such a high reputation in such a short period of time. It was inseparable from the fierce competition between the 2 giants. The inventor of the new textile machine, Mr. Dean, has personally given us the blueprints. We are an orthodox original. The new textile machine will never have any parts failure, damage, and other problems. The Scott Consortium's highest statement was written in one of the newspapers of the Scott Consortium. Although there was no awareness of copyright in this world, except for alchemists and other dark professions, there were no laws to regulate plagiarism. However, the lack of awareness of copyright didn't mean that there was no concept of counterfeiting. Even ordinary civilians wanted to buy the most formal and sophisticated product. They didn't want others to imitate them. The importance of this statement was undoubtedly critical and fatal. It seems that the Mellon Consortium doesn't have the capital to compete with the Scott Consortium. It's only a matter of time before they suffer a crushing defeat. Other consortia who want to intervene will only be able to grab a small share of the market and profits. Dudien saw the current situation. The Scott Consortium had provided the blueprint. They had taken the lead in producing the new textile machine and occupied a large share of the market. Now there was this statement. As long as there were no problems in the later stage of the operation, this big cake could be eaten. It could even become one of the main industries of the Scott Consortium in the future. At this time, old Foulin came back from the outside. Dean's sense of smell had picked up another smell from the living room. It had left the castle and was mixed with the smell of horses. Is there any difficulty? Dean asked as he saw Dudien's worried expression. Old Foulin looked at him and sighed. Mr. John is a new rich businessman. His assets are more than 10,000 gold coins. He started his business by mining. He heard that our consortium is renting the giant wall, so he wanted to cooperate with us. They will provide equipment production fees, and we will provide hunters to hunt outside the giant wall. They will get 20% of the resources and the rest will belong to us. Dean said. Did he come over to withdraw his intention of cooperation? Old Foulin nodded. If it's only him then it's okay. But I'm worried that the news of your injury will spread. Other people who want to cooperate with us will dispel the idea. If that's the case, then it will be too difficult to develop the Ryan family's business and your hunting funds. Dean comforted him. We don't need to count on these small characters. Even if we cooperate with them, the efficiency of making money is too slow. Moreover, they want to get 20% of the profits just by providing equipment. A group of people who haven't seen the dangers outside the giant wall have completely regarded this as an investment game. Old Foulin smiled. Although the sand is small, but it can be gathered into a tower. Dean shook his head. A tower made of sand can't withstand the storm. Even a small storm can cut a lot of sand. If my right arm is restored, then I can rely on hunting alone to make money. At this point, he couldn't help but look at his left hand. What he was most worried about was that his left hand couldn't be healed. If that was the case, his battle strength would be greatly reduced in the future. Moreover, the archery he had painstakingly practiced for several years would be in vain. He would have to relearn his one-handed combat skills. If he wanted to master a new skill, it would take another 2 to 3 years. Old Foulin also looked at his bandaged arm. His face was bitter, but he didn't say anything. You have a good recovery. In the following days, Dean didn't run around, but stayed in the Ryan castle to recuperate. He asked the butler to buy him some paper and pen. He wrote and drew in his room. The papers were scattered on the ground. Old Foulin occasionally came to check on his condition. He noticed the things on the paper and asked curiously, "What is this?" "Cannon," Dean replied briefly. Old Foulin naturally didn't understand the meaning of these two words. He felt that the combination of these two words was a bit strange. However, he knew that Dudien didn't want to talk about it. So he didn't ask. Moreover, it would make him look more profound. In addition to writing and drawing, Dean would occasionally go out for a walk. He would exercise his body, bask in the sun, or come to the training ground. He would use his right hand to play with swords, daggers, knives, daggers, and other weapons. It seemed that he was just playing with them for fun. Old Foulin's children, who were paying attention to Dean's physical condition, were worried. The types of cold weapons are a bit poor. Dean played with the spear. Because of the existence of knights, the spear had become a sacred symbol. No one tried to change the structure of the spear to reproduce weapons, such as halberds and daggers. It's a bit difficult to use a spear with one hand. It's better to use a sword or a dagger. Although the diagnosis hadn't come out yet and he wasn't sure whether his left arm would be healed or not. But Dean was ready for the worst. He had to replan his future route. In the blink of an eye, more than a month had passed. The middle-aged doctor had come to check up on Dean 4 times. Every time he left with a sigh. According to him, Dean's left arm was necrotic. The blood couldn't flow to all parts of the arm. The healing of the bones was very weak. Moreover, as time went on, the broken bones would gradually rot and eventually wouldn't be able to recover. Dean's heart was full of loss and pain, even though he was prepared for such a result. On this day, he left the Ryan castle by carriage. He said that he was going out to relax. Old Foulin didn't think much about it. He told him to protect his left arm so that it wouldn't get hurt. Chapter 228. Dean put on a black robe and mask as he entered the town. Once again, he came to the front of the manor. Dean saw the guards at the door. He handed over the temporary identity certificate that was issued to him last time. Several guards took turns to check and let him pass. Dean saw 4 attendants under the huge oil painting as he entered the hall of the castle. They came forward and handed over their temporary IDs. Then they entered the dark passage under the oil painting. I don't know if the last application was accepted or not. I was busy with the consortium, so I didn't have time to collect it. This time I can take a look at the result. Dean's eyes flashed as he stepped out of the dark passage. Soft light hit his face. He saw that the underground square was more lively than the last time. There were camouflaged dark professionals everywhere. Dean went along the square to look for the shops that sold goods. Soon he saw a shop opened by an alchemist of the life faction. There were bottles of potions in the shop. Various biological organs were soaked in them. There were women's arms, baby's head, liver, heart, and other organs that were soaked in the potion. They were kept fresh. In addition to selling all kinds of life alchemy materials, the shop also sold several low-level alchemy recipes. Magic eye technique? Can you embed the eyeball of other creatures into your own eye socket and get the ability of other creatures' eyeballs? Dean was surprised as he saw the description of the alchemy. The alchemists of the life faction were able to achieve such a level of biological transformation. Even in the old era, the technology in this area was only superficial. In theory, if the technology was developed to the extreme, it could be possible to replace the head and the heart. Then it could be called as immortality. This was the ultimate pursuit of all the life factions. Dean looked at the other alchemy recipes. He didn't see any that could replace the arm. He immediately asked the shop owner, "Is there a way to treat the broken leg?" The shop owner's figure was slender and slender. Her mask was tied under her beautiful brown hair. She suppressed her original voice and said in a low voice, "It's very difficult to treat. This shop doesn't have a cure. But I can help you replace your thigh with a new one. There will be no side effects. This shop has superior leg materials from hunters. I guarantee that they are better than your own legs. Do you want to try?" Dean was startled and asked, "Hunter's thigh? How did you get here?" "That's a secret of the shop. Please forgive me," the shop owner said politely. Dean thought for a moment. "Do you know where to get treatment?" Seeing that he had no intention of buying, the shop owner's tone immediately became cold. He said, "I'm not sure about this. Maybe you should ask the star-level alchemist. There will be some clues." Dean slightly frowned and nodded. "Thank you. No need." Dean turned and left the shop. He searched in other shops. In addition to the alchemists of the life faction, he also thought of potioneers. Although potioneers mainly made potions and were good at using poison, but after all they were in contact with pharmacology. Maybe there would be a way. Suddenly, a surprised voice rang out. "Hound? Oh no, Demon King?" Dean was surprised. He looked back and saw a pretty figure wearing an owl mask. Although there were many such masks, but the smell exuded from her body immediately reminded him. "Nightingale?" Yes. Nightingale knew that she wasn't mistaken when Dean called out her code name. "Why didn't you come back for so many days? Didn't you say that you would come back in 3 days to receive the medal?" Dean coughed. "I was delayed in the middle. How do you know that I haven't come back?" "Of course I know. I come here every day," Nightingale softly said. Dean smiled. "You are diligent." "I am not." Nightingale looked at him. "Didn't you come today to see the god's object?" Dean was surprised. "God's object?" Nightingale saw his reaction. "It seems that you really don't know. Come, I'll take you to see. I guarantee that you will be shocked." She went towards the dark hall in front of them. Dean was also curious, so he followed them. After entering the hall, Dean saw 10 dark knights standing in front of a huge cage on the side of the hall. The steel pillars of the cage were extremely thick. They were like the arms of adult men. It was stronger than any cage he had seen before. When he saw the object in the cage clearly, even with his indifferent disposition, his pupils couldn't help but constrict, and a strand of astonishment surged out from his heart, followed by wild joy. "Well, this is the god's object." Nightingale came to the hall and pointed at the cage, saying, "See, it's all metal, and it's not just a single metal, it's a very rare compound alloy. TSK, it's simply a masterpiece of the light god. My alloy alchemy is not worth mentioning compared to this." Dean didn't hear her words. His eyes were focused on the object inside the cage. He was very familiar with this thing. It was the freezer that he had been lying in for 300 years. It turns out that the freezer is missing. Dark Church found it. Dean felt his heartbeat speed up, and the blood in his whole body was faintly boiling. He couldn't wait to rush up and plunder it. With the remaining energy tubes in the freezer, he could learn a lot of knowledge from the superchip. Nightingale saw that Dean didn't answer but just stared at the object. She was quite satisfied. "Isn't it shocking?" "Yes." Dean returned to his senses and nodded. "Look at this curve, this curvature. I've never seen such a large model made of metal. It's hard to imagine how it was made. Moreover, it's been 300 years since the ancient era, yet it doesn't show any signs of decay. It's amazing." Nightingale couldn't help but express her amazement. Duddian looked at her and asked, "Why did this thing appear here?" Nightingale said, "It is said that it was moved here for us to visit. Do you see the gap in the middle? According to the speculation, the inside of this thing is empty. But there is no correct way to open it. The only way is to use violence to destroy it. So the Dark Church is gathering ideas to see if anyone knows the correct way to crack it. Look at the bounty column next to it." Chapter 229. 100,000 alchemy points? Dean was surprised. As far as he knew, the requirement to become a 1-star alchemist was to accumulate 100 alchemy points. 2-star alchemy points required 1,000 points. 100,000 alchemy points was equivalent to the accumulation of a 4-star alchemist. Most of the 4-star alchemists had immersed themselves in alchemy for decades to have such an achievement. Now, as long as they opened the so-called God's object, they could get it? Nightingale sighed. "If I can learn some knowledge of the era, then maybe I can know how to open this God's object." Dean's mouth slightly twitched. He thought that it didn't matter how much knowledge she had. The freezer only locked his fingerprint and iris password. In addition to him, no one could open it unless they disassembled it by force. "Will this thing always be here?" Dean asked. Nightingale shook her head. "I heard that it will be moved to another branch of the Dark Church. So while it is still here, we should observe it. Maybe we can get some inspiration. I heard that someone found the mystery of air flow from this God's object. I hope we can see the secret of the air flow." Dean wryly smiled. He thought that the secret of the freezer was not something that could be seen and understood by the current technology. However, he was quite moved as he thought about the reward of 100,000 alchemy points. He knew from Roseyard's notes that the higher the star metal, the higher the rights of the Dark Church. For example, a 3-star alchemist like Roseyard could dispatch a team of Dark Knights from the Dark Church to fight for him. The lowest level of the Dark Knights was comparable to a primary hunter's physique. Even the disciplinary members would find it difficult to deal with the Dark Knights. However, in order to mobilize the Dark Knights, one must be at least a 5-star alchemist. In addition to summoning the Dark Knights, one could receive a very high monthly salary. However, the best benefit for alchemists was to share the intelligence network of the Dark Church. They could collect information for themselves. The intelligence network of the Dark Church was extremely terrifying. The coverage was more dense and extensive than that of the Holy Church. They could penetrate into all fields. As long as they paid the corresponding price, they could quickly learn any information. Even some military secrets were no exception. This freezer disappeared 3 or 4 years ago. It should have fallen into the hands of the Dark Church for a long time. They haven't cracked the password for such a long time. If I open it, it will attract a lot of attention from all parties. It might even cause unwarranted suspicion and interrogation. In such a long period of time, they must have thought of every possible way. Even if I say that I opened it by coincidence, it won't make sense." Dean's eyes flashed, and the desire in his heart calmed down. He felt that the bounty notice was like a hook with a sharp barb. The bait was fat and tempting. If he couldn't resist the temptation, he would be finished. Thinking of this, he withdrew his gaze and said to Nightingale, "Let's go somewhere else." Nightingale saw that he was not in the mood to look at it, so she did not continue to force him to stay. She had already seen it countless times in the past few days, so a little while longer was not a big deal. She said, "You haven't received your medal, right? I'll go with you." Dudian nodded. Both of them came to an empty counter in the hall. Dudian handed out the temporary ID card. "I've come to receive my medal." There was an old man behind the counter who was responsible for the registration of newcomers. He didn't wear a mask and his face was full of stubble. He lazily yawned as he glanced at Dudian. It seemed that he was blaming him for disturbing his nap. He took the temporary ID card and looked at it. "Oh, codename Devil?" The old man squinted at Dudian. "The little guy's tone is quite big. It's better to have a low-key codename. Be careful not to become the first target of the holy light of the Holy Church." Dudian just looked at him, but didn't speak. The old man saw that Dudian didn't answer him, so he felt that it would be rude to talk too much. He looked back at the small drawers on the wall. He searched for a moment and soon found a drawer box. He took out a bunch of keys from his waist and opened it. He took out a few items from the drawer box. "This is your medal. This is your admission fee. This is the recommendation letter from the Holy Church to the Alchemy College. Little guy, I hope you can live eternally in the darkness. Welcome to join us." The old man handed over the medal and a bag of gold coins. His previous sleepy appearance became solemn. He raised his hand and made a commonly used prayer gesture in front of his chest. He prayed, "Sublimate in the darkness and return to the truth. The sun will sting your eyes, but the darkness will make your eyes bright. From now on you will become a believer of my Lord. You will serve my Lord for life. You will find the truth in the hypocrisy. If you betray me, you will suffer the punishment of purgatory. Do you understand?" "Understood." Dudian nodded. This was the initiation ceremony. The Dark Church believed in the true God. The Holy Church called the God of light a false god. The Holy Church called the God of the Dark Church a devil. After the initiation ceremony, the old man's expression returned to normal. He waved his hand. "If there is nothing else, then go and do what you need to do. Don't disturb my nap." Dudian put away the gold coins on the table. They were heavy. He estimated that there were hundreds of gold coins. Although these gold coins were not worth mentioning for his current vision and assets, but hundreds of gold coins was a cost that ordinary families would find difficult to earn in their lifetime. It could be seen that almost all the wealth in the world was in the hands of aristocrats and rich businessmen. The proportion of wealth was seriously skewed. He looked at his medal. One side was engraved with two hands holding a stone. It symbolized the stone was purified into gold. The other side was engraved with his code. It represented that he was an alchemist of the material faction. If he was an alchemist of the life faction, then the two hands would be holding a human head. It represented eternal life. Recommendation letter from the Alchemy College? Dudian looked at the other letter. He was surprised. He asked the old man, "Is there an alchemy college?" The old man glanced at him. "Of course. Your friend should have joined a long time ago. Ask her. Don't disturb me. Go." Nightingale looked at Dudian. "Let's go and talk." Dudian nodded and left. He followed Nightingale to the outside of the hall. Nightingale said as they walked, "The Alchemy College is the same as our branch, built under an ordinary college. There are all kinds of alchemy knowledge taught there, but the tuition is more expensive. Of course, if you have good grades, the tuition can be waived." Dudian was surprised. "Isn't it easy to be exposed?" Nightingale nodded. "The possibility of exposure is high. But we have the protection of the Dark Church. Unless there is too much movement, the Holy Church will turn a blind eye. So don't worry. The degree of safety is relatively high." Chapter 230. If your teacher doesn't teach you, then I suggest you go to the Alchemy College. You can learn a lot of knowledge there. Occasionally there will be alchemy masters who will come to give lectures and broaden your horizons. Nightingale suggested to Dudian. "I will." Dudian nodded. He wanted to go to the alchemy college to find a way to restore his left hand. Nightingale smiled behind her mask when she saw him agree. She said, "Since that's the case, I'll be waiting for you at the alchemy college. Speaking of which, I can be considered your senior apprentice sister. I'll call you junior apprentice brother from now on. Your code name is too ostentatious. I'm afraid you'll get beaten up if others hear about it." Dean Riley smiled. He had thought of this code name on a whim. He didn't expect that no one would use it. Now that he thought about it, it was really arrogant. But it was also good to remind himself not to let a short period of ease and laziness erode him. "Then I'll call you Senior Sister Nightingale." Dudian changed the topic. "Do you know any alchemy items that can treat fractures? I have a friend whose leg was broken by a stone." "Fracture injury?" Nightingale thought for a moment. "I know of nothing but the Fountain of Life that can treat such an injury. But the price of the Fountain of Life is too expensive. Moreover, you have the authority to buy it. You can't buy it unless you are a star-level disciple." "Fountain of Life? You don't know?" Nightingale was somewhat surprised. "Your teacher is really lazy. Didn't he teach you anything? The Fountain of Life is also sold in the Holy Church, but only the internal members of the Holy Church can buy it. This is the best healing medicine. Even broken bones can be repaired. It is said that it can also regenerate broken fingers. It is extremely magical. The Holy Church said that it is a gift from the God of Light, but in fact it was developed by the Dark Church." Nightingale said with a bit of disdain and pride in her voice. Dudien's eyes lit up. "How much is this thing?" Nightingale saw that he was tempted. She immediately said, "You should dispel this idea. This is not something that can be bought with money. The Dark Church uses points to trade. This Fountain of Life needs 5,000 points to buy." Dudien wrinkled his brows. "So expensive?" "Of course, it's a human life at the critical moment," Nightingale said. "So, people like us who haven't stepped into the threshold of the star class shouldn't think about it. Although it's a pity that your friend's leg is broken, we can only let him get used to it." Dean shook his head. "I'll go and see if the potion master has any solution." Nightingale sighed and said, "Well, I still have some activities in the academy, so I'll go back first. I wish your friend a speedy recovery." After she left, Dean turned around and continued to inquire in other shops. Although he was told that in addition to the Fountain of Life, there was a kind of regeneration agent, refined by the alchemists of the Life faction, which could greatly heal injuries. But the price was extremely expensive, and there was no market for it. Dean couldn't help but feel disappointed. However, he wasn't too depressed as he had expected it from Nightingale's mouth. His eyes couldn't help but fall on the distant branch of the Dark Church. His eyes flashed for a moment, but he suppressed the impulse in his heart. He took a deep look at the dark nights that could be seen everywhere in the square. He turned around and sat in the carriage to return to the Ryan castle. In the carriage, Dean changed his clothes and took out the alchemy letter. He opened it and saw dense characters written on it. It was a poem written by a bard. Some of the sentences were not smooth. It was as if several poems were put together. At the end of the poem, there was a string of alchemy symbols. Dean saw the string of alchemy symbols and immediately knew how to read it. He read it according to the diagonal lines of the alchemy symbols. Blood Reef Alchemy College. Address: 109 Red Tower Street. Dean sorted out word by word. After a moment, he confirmed that there was no message left. He took out a match and burned the letter to ashes. When the carriage reached the suburban road, he put away the medal of the Dark Church. He wanted to find a secret place to hide it. It was dusk by the time he returned to the Ryan castle. After dinner with old Foulin, Dean went back to his room. He took out a pen and paper to write and draw. This time it wasn't a big piece of paper but a simple topographic map. Old Foulin pushed the door and entered the room. He looked at Dean. "This is your cold crystal." He took out a gray bag and handed it to Dean. Dean's eyes lit up as he took it and opened it. There were 4 blue and round cold crystals inside. They were the 4 cold crystals that he had hunted. He was overjoyed. "Thank you. Your business is my business. There is no need to thank me." There was a faint smile on old Fouline's face. Dean looked at him. "I want to go outside the giant wall again in a few days." "Again?" Old Fouline looked at him in surprise. "You just came back. The radiation in your body hasn't been digested yet. If you go outside the giant wall, the radiation will accumulate in your body. Moreover, your arm hasn't healed yet." Dean shook his head. "Ordinary medical treatment can't cure my hand. I went to ask my friend, who is an alchemy warlock. He knows that there is an alchemy item that can cure my arm, but it costs too much money." "Are you talking about the Fountain of Life?" Old Fouline was surprised. Dean looked at him in surprise. "You know about it? Our family knows a lot about alchemy warlock. This thing is also sold in the Holy Church, but only people from the Holy Church can buy it. If we are still a member of the Melon Consortium, then we can ask the Knights of Light under the Melon Consortium to buy it for us." Old Fouline sighed. "A few days ago I went to the Scott Consortium hoping that they could help us buy it. But the price is too expensive. We need 50,000 gold coins. We only have 10,000 gold coins in our hand. We wanted to give them a credit, but they didn't agree." Dean said, "Don't worry about it. I'll solve it myself." Old Fouline looked at him and smiled. "It's getting late. You should rest early." Then he turned around and opened the door. After he left, Dean's eyes fell on the 4 cold crystals in his hand. He immediately took off his shoes and went to the bed. He grabbed a dagger from the bedside table and cut his right finger. He took out a cold crystal and held it in his hand. The cold crystal quickly dissolved into a mucus and penetrated into his body through the blood on his finger. After a while, his whole body was alternating between extreme cold and extreme heat. When the feeling gradually subsided, Dean clearly felt that his physical strength had increased a little, and his thinking was sharper than before. One at a time. I can't be greedy. Dean put away the remaining 3 cold crystals. He didn't want his right arm to end up like his left hand. Dean continued to improve the previous simple map according to his memory. It was late at night. He felt tired, so he lay down and went to sleep. The next morning, Dean got up on time. He ate breakfast and left the Ryan castle. Once again he went to the Dark Church's branch. He wandered around, but spent most of his time in front of the freezer in the hall to observe the situation. There were dozens of people in the freezer, so it wasn't eye-catching. Time passed by quickly. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. On the 3rd night, Dean closed the door as usual to absorb the 3rd cold crystal. As the number of absorption increased, the feeling of extreme cold and extreme heat gradually faded. He could easily bear it. So much so that Dean was thinking about other things while he was absorbing the cold crystal. Suddenly he heard a subtle sound from his left hand. It woke him up. Chapter 231. Dean looked down. The bandage on his left hand was very tight, but there was no abnormality. Puzzled, he stretched out his hand and pinched it. Unexpectedly, as soon as his palm touched his left arm, he felt a cold feeling. It was like touching an extremely cold ice block. He immediately retracted his fingers. He suddenly remembered that when his left hand absorbed too much of the cold crystal for the first time, a large amount of ice seeped out from his pores. It was also so cold. He quickly cut the bandage on his left hand with a dagger and quickly peeled it off. Several plates used to fix the bones also fell, revealing the arm inside. Suddenly, he saw a layer of light blue crystal on the surface of the skin. There were faint contours on it like pieces of scales that were cut off. Each piece was the size of a thumb, spreading from the shoulder down, but the part below the elbow did not have any. Dean was startled. This light blue crystal was a bit like thin ice, just like the embryonic form of the last time when his arm was frozen. Obviously, I used my right hand to absorb it. How could my left hand have such a situation? Dean was confused. Suddenly, he thought of an explanation. Could it be that his left hand was necrotic, causing the cold absorbed by his right hand to pour into his left hand, but it was not digested by his left hand? While he was guessing, the cold continued to seep out from his left hand, condensing into ice-like light blue crystal scales on the surface of his skin. Seeing this scene, his face was very ugly. If the cold penetrated from his arm, then the water in his arm was likely to have been stripped off, which was a great damage to the human body. Moreover, the water was likely to be stripped from the blood, which completely cut off the hope of treatment on his left hand. Damn it! Dean gritted his teeth. Did he have to replace the prosthesis? Even if it was a prosthesis, there was no way to replace it with the current technology, unless he transplanted someone else's arm. He grabbed the quilt next to him and covered his left hand, hoping to reduce the speed of the condensation of the cold crystal. It would be better if he could melt the condensed cold crystal. After covering the quilt, Dean rubbed the crystal scales on his left hand. He felt that the crystal scales were extremely smooth. After a moment of rapid rubbing, he suddenly felt something was wrong. There was no water vapor on the cold crystal. He reached out and pressed it. He was surprised to find that the crystal scales were slightly concave like flesh. Although the flexibility was far less than the skin, it was completely different from ice. This isn't ice? Dean couldn't help but re-examine the crystal scales. He reached out and pinched it. If he used a little more strength, he could pinch the crystal scales. It was a pity that he couldn't feel his left hand. Otherwise he could judge whether the crystal scales were closely related to his body or not. Dudian immediately tried to bend his arm after knowing that the crystal scales were not hard ice. He found that his left hand was able to bend freely. It was not affected by the crystal scales. It didn't break like a frozen object. Could it be that the cold crystal energy in my body has mutated into a layer of scales on my left hand? Dean's eyes flashed. The appearance of special tissues in the body is generally a characteristic of senior hunters. When the potential of the magic marks is stimulated, the penetration of the human cell structure will become deeper and deeper, leading to mixing with each other. In some parts, some special tissues will be derived. Most of these tissues are the residual genetic information of the biological tissues that the magic marks had parasitized. Glenn should have such a special tissue, but she has hidden it. However, my magic marks have been stimulated for the first time and I have just become an intermediate hunter. The crystal scales on my left hand have nothing to do with magic mark. It was infected by something attached to the cold crystal. After all, the cold crystal is an unknown substance. It's too risky. Dean was aware of his boldness, but it was meaningless to regret. His main purpose was to increase his strength and kill Linda. However, his body was unknowingly changing in a direction that he didn't know about. The only good thing was that it was only his left hand that had an abnormality, not his whole body. Dean continued to observe his left hand. He tried to move it gently, although there was no feeling, but he immediately found that his left hand seemed to have recovered a lot. He could move it freely without any effort. Moreover, the shape of his arm was close to its original shape. The necrotic tissue and extravasated blood seemed to have been digested and disappeared without a trace. The material of the crystal scales is like the stratum corneum, but also like hardened biological glue. It is much softer than the hardened stratum corneum. Is it possible that the broken bones were glued together by this biological glue? Dean touched his arm. He wanted to dissect it to dispel his speculation, but he held back. He was happy and worried at the same time. He was happy that his left hand didn't seem to be crippled. There was hope of recovery. He was worried that he had never heard that cold crystal could heal injuries. What if the crystallization of his left hand spread throughout his body in the future? How would he treat it? At that time, could he still be regarded as a human? I have to prepare a bottle of fountain of life so that I can feel more at ease. Dean secretly thought. He took out a roll of gauze from the drawer and wrapped it around himself. At the same time, he decided to let old Foulin inform the middle-aged doctor that he didn't need to come back for a follow-up visit. 5,000 points. According to the trading points of the Dark Church and the market price, it is equivalent to about 20,000 gold coins. Moreover, only star-level alchemists can buy it. In this case, I need to spend at least 30,000 gold coins to buy a star-level alchemist to help me buy it. Dean quickly calculated in his mind. He couldn't use formal means, so he could only use other illegal means. In fact, it wasn't a violation of the rules, but the acquiescence of the rules. He fell on the bed and looked at the ceiling. He was lost in thought and unknowingly fell asleep. The next day, Dean had breakfast and was about to go to the Dark Church's branch. Suddenly, the butler brought news from outside. He looked at old Foulin, who was sitting opposite to Dean. "Master, someone from the Temple of Elements has come to visit you. Do you want to see him?" Old Foulin was surprised. He put down the newspaper in his hand and looked at Dean. His weather-beaten eyes flashed. "Call him up. I'll wait for him here." "Yes." The butler respectfully retreated. Old Foulin looked at Dean. "Are you going out? Stay here for now. This person is probably here to look for you." Chapter 232. A middle-aged gentleman, accompanied by the butler, came upstairs to the dining room. His eyes lit up as he saw old Foulin and Dean eating. He took off his hat and bowed to old Foulin. "Greetings, Patriarch. Is this Mr. Dean?" Old Foulin smiled. "Yes, this time you can talk to Mr. Dean personally. Although our consortium has recruited Mr. Dean, but the contract doesn't restrict his personal freedom." "That's great." The middle-aged man's face was full of joy as he looked at Dean. "Mr. Dean, you can call me Carey. I don't know if you have heard of the Temple of Elements. It is the place where hunters bring back materials from outside the giant wall for final evaluation and identification. I'm here on behalf of the Temple of Elements to invite you to join us." Dean had a premonition when he saw the newspaper about him being an inventor. He didn't think that this thing would really come. He said, "I've heard a little about it, but I don't know much about it. Can you tell me more about it?" Carey was overjoyed as he saw Dean's interest. "It's my pleasure. The members of the Temple of Elements are great inventors like you. We are also devout believers of the God of Light. Our job is to replace the God of Light, to find the blessings of the universe and pass them to the nobles and civilians. There is a comfortable environment, generous treatment, and all kinds of materials. You can use all your talents and discover more blessings." Dean narrowed his eyes. "I'm a devout believer of the God of Light. I'm loyal to the God of Light. But I have a little doubt. I hope Mr. Carey can answer it for me." Carey laughed. "Mr. Dean, please say it," Dean said. "We're just discovering the blessings of the God of Light. Why aren't we called inventors? Isn't that blasphemy against the God of Light?" Carey was stunned for a moment. "Mr. Dean, you are mistaken. Our Temple of Elements was created by the Holy Church. How can we blaspheme the great God of Light? The meaning of invention represents discovery and understanding. It means that we not only discover but also understand the blessings of the God of Light. It represents our gratitude and awe. That's why we are called inventors," Dean said. "So that's how it was interpreted." Carey smiled and said, "Mr. Dean, please don't feel burdened. They are all believers of the God of Light. Inventor is a very outdated title in the past. Nowadays, no one uses it anymore. We prefer to call you God's messenger." Dean nodded. "Mr. Carey knows that I'm a hunter. Hunters pay attention to pragmatism and benefit. So what benefits will I get if I join the Temple of Elements?" Carey smiled. "There are many benefits. The first is the material aspect. The Temple of Elements will give you a castle in the commercial district. If you perform well and become a senior architect, you will be granted a fief. The territory area will be the same as that of a noble. In addition, you will be paid 100 gold coins every month. The higher your status, the higher the reward will be. Dean's eyes slightly moved. There was some surprise and fear in his heart. How could the Holy Church grant ordinary civilians fiefdoms? Wasn't this the exclusive right of the military? Carrie continued to tempt him. In addition to these, the Temple of Elements will allow you to display your talents. You will not only get endless wealth but also supreme glory. Dean asked, "What do I need to pay in order to get so many benefits?" There was a little surprise in Carrie's eyes as he saw Dean's calm expression. But he quickly said, "You don't need to pay anything. As long as you join the Temple of Elements and complete the tasks given to you. In addition, if you find any inventions, you need to hand them over to the temple." "What tasks?" "They're all small missions such as appraising the value of the materials of the monsters outside the wall. Don't worry, we have professional god relics for you to use. It's okay if you don't know some of the missions, as you can swap them with other missions of the same level. Even if you don't know any of the missions, you can still ask for support," Carrie said while smiling. Dean understood. "I will think about it." Carrie saw that there was no yearning or expectation on Dean's face. He wanted to say something but hesitated. "Well, I'll wait for Mr. Dean's good news. Also, I want to tell you that the evil alchemists like to attack the architect. If you join the Temple of Elements, we will provide you with absolute protection. You will be free from danger." Dean looked up at him. "Thank you for reminding me." Carrie didn't stay any longer. He said goodbye to old Foulene and left with the butler. Old Foulene looked at Dean after he left. "Do you want to join the Temple of Elements? There are a lot of benefits, but there are also some disadvantages. You won't be as free as you are now. But in general, it's worth joining. It's a dream for most people. Moreover, the little guy's threat is not wrong. You have created a new textile machine. Dark Church's followers will try to assassinate you. Although you are a hunter, assassinations are everywhere. They can use poison and sneak attacks to easily kill hunters." Dean understood this point. Hunters were strong but not invincible. It was difficult to defeat them, but it was much easier to assassinate them. "I don't have time for the time being, but I will think about it," Dean thoughtfully said. "If I join the Temple of Elements, then I will be able to buy Fountain of Life. Moreover, I will have the identity of an architect of the Temple of Elements. I won't suffer any injustice. It can be regarded as a shield for our consortium." Foulene nodded. He saw that Dean understood the stakes. "I believe that you will make the right choice." Then he picked up his crutches and left the table. Dean didn't stay too long after Foulene left. According to his original plan, he put on his coat and left the Ryan castle. He hired a carriage and went to the branch of the Dark Church. For the next few days, Dudian became more and more cautious in the Dark Church's branch. He didn't want to be followed. There were dozens of people standing in the hall. They surrounded the freezer and observed it. They wanted to find a way to open it, but the freezer was protected by the iron cage and couldn't be touched. It was quite difficult for them to see the way to open it. Dean also pretended to observe, but his attention was focused on the surroundings. In the blink of an eye, another day passed. Chapter 233. It was the 6th day after Carrie invited Dudian. Early in the morning, the weather was cloudy. Today was the same as usual. Dudian accompanied old Foulene to have breakfast in the morning. After eating, he left the Ryan castle alone. He sat in the carriage of the Ryan family and left the town. He got out of the carriage and walked through the wilderness. He came to the gunpowder workshop in another town. In the courtyard behind the workshop, there was a carriage that he had bought a few days ago from a horse market in the residential area. The decoration of the carriage was very ordinary and inconspicuous. Dudian had handed over 7 boxes of black fire to Barton and the others to make to the carriage. Dudian drove the carriage out of the town and went to the branch of the Dark Church. The guards outside the manor stopped the carriage. Dudyan was already familiar with the place. He took out his medal from his black robe and handed it over. Several guards took turns to check it. One of the guards glanced at the carriage. "Is there anything in the carriage?" Dudyan indifferently said, "We are here to sell some goods." The guard didn't say much. He opened the door and let the carriage drive in. Dudyan drove the carriage to a remote lawn of the manor. There were 5 or 6 carriages parked here. Dudyan's eyes lit up as he jumped out of the carriage. He tied the horse rope to the pillar and entered the castle. Dudyan came to the underground dark square from the passage under the huge oil painting. He went to the hall and looked around. Everything was as usual. He stayed for a while and then returned to the square. He came to the front of one of the potion shops. He saw that there were various plants and some bottles and jars in the shop. Potioneering was an extremely dreadful profession. Even a senior hunter wouldn't dare to provoke them. Otherwise, a small drop of venom would be enough to easily kill them. Moreover, it was impossible to guard against them. Potioneering was the most frightening aspect of a potioneering profession. "Boss, the narcotic fog that I ordered last time. Did it arrive today?" Dudyan asked the shop owner in a hoarse voice. The boss was a slender figure covered in a purple robe, slim and elegant, but occasionally exposed from the robe. There were a few dark brown ugly scars on her white wrists, which were extremely eye-catching and dazzling. At first glance, it was obvious that the scars were left by the erosion of toxins. Her voice was neutral as she said to Dean, "It has been delivered. Including the deposit, it still needs 250 gold coins. Did you bring it?" Dudyan nodded and took out a bag of gold coins from his robe. "Please count." The purple-robed woman poured out the gold coins, picked one up, and rubbed it against the gold testing stone. Seeing that it was genuine gold coins, she nodded slightly and counted them one by one. Soon, she finished counting and said, "Not bad, the amount is just right, no more, no less. I'll go get the goods for you." She put away the bag of gold coins and went back to a locked cabinet in the shop. She took out 2 bottles and a small medicine bottle. "These 2 bottles are the narcotic fog. This one is the antidote." The woman handed the things to Dudyan. She looked at him and said in a low voice, "Please use it carefully. Only a small tube of the narcotic fog can make an adult wild boar unconscious. If you want to kill people, the amount here is enough to make all the people in a small town unconscious and die." Hearing her words, Dudyan carefully put away the narcotic fog. He turned and left the shop to wander in front of other shops. Time passed unknowingly. It was evening. The number of people in the square didn't decrease. Instead, it was getting more and more lively. These people were busy with their own things during the day, and had time to come out in the evening. Dudyan found a place to sit down and rest, quietly waiting for the time to pass. At about 7 o'clock, the number of people in the square was extremely dense and lively. This was the most lively time of the day. After 12 o'clock, the number of people would gradually decrease and leave. Dudyan saw that the time was almost ripe. He returned to the carriage outside the castle. He entered the carriage for a moment and then turned back to the square. This time, he went through the crowd and went directly to the hall. He saw hundreds of people observing the freezing chamber. It was extremely dense. It could be seen that the number of members of the Dark Church was not inferior to that of the Holy Church. At the same time, some people who knew each other were talking in low voices, pointing and talking about their findings and insight. Dudyan's eyes flashed behind the mask. He stood behind the crowd and looked around. When no one was paying attention to him, he pulled out 2 bottles from under his robe and threw them. One was thrown up and one was thrown down. One was thrown to the top of the hall and the other was thrown to a gap in the ground a few meters away. Bang! Bang! The 2 bottles suddenly shattered. This sudden strange sound startled everyone. When the crowd looked at the source of the sound, they saw thick dark green smoke rolling from the ground. In addition, there were a lot of glass fragments falling from the top of the head and a lot of green clouds floating down. In an instant there was a woman who screamed, "It's poison!" This scream spread like a disease. The others didn't even have time to react before they turned pale with fright. When they saw the horrifying color of the green mist, they hurriedly ran out of the main hall. For a time, the crowd was crowded. Many people were knocked down to the ground. They didn't have time to climb up. They were pressed down by the people behind them. Some were trampled on their heads, necks, arms, and other parts of the body. They struggled in pain and pushed their arms. However, they tripped other people who were running away in panic and fell to the ground. The green mist spread out like boiling water. Dudian took out a pill and quickly swallowed it. His eyes were extremely calm. He ran along the wall and bypassed the crazy crowd. Soon he came to the huge cage opposite the hall. He saw that the 10 dark knights standing there were scared when they saw the green fog. They didn't know whether they should continue to guard here or choose to take refuge. But in the end, they endured the terror of the poisonous mist, gritted their teeth, and persisted here. They covered their mouths with their hands while they gazed vigilantly at the surroundings while their other hand drew the swords at their waist. Once someone approached them, they wouldn't hesitate to attack even if they killed the wrong person. Because they knew that the target of this person who attacked them with poisonous mist was definitely the divine treasures of the last era that they were protecting. The green fog quickly spread into the main hall, shrouding it in a green haze. It also spread out from the entrance of the main hall. Most of the people who were originally in the main hall did not manage to escape. Their figures were submerged in the green fog and fell one by one. Dudian went around to the front of a dark knight who was next to the cage. He returned to the carriage and took out a one-handed sword. The sword pierced through the dark knight's throat. The knight didn't even have time to scream. But his death caused the sword in his hand to fall to the ground. It immediately attracted the attention of the other dark knights. They knew that the attacker had appeared. Dudian found that his vision was less affected by the green fog. Although he was shrouded in the green fog, he could still see the silhouette of the dark knights. Since his left hand was seriously injured, he couldn't practice archery. So he had been practicing close combat with swords, daggers, and other weapons. Although he wasn't proficient in them, he wasn't unfamiliar with them either. With the advantage of his vision, Dudian quickly stabbed 3 people to death. In the process of assassination, the fingertips of his left hand swept over the thick iron pillar. With the previous experience, he was sure that his fingers could corrode the metal of the iron pillar. But because of the thickness of the pillar, it would take a little time to break it. After killing 3 dark knights, the remaining dark knights couldn't hold their breath. The poisonous fog invaded their bodies and they fell to the ground. Dudian immediately grabbed the cage with both hands as he saw that no one was obstructing him. His fingernails quickly cut through the iron pillar. Time passed second by second. Dudian was extremely nervous. He couldn't wait for time to stop. Finally, when he counted to 123, the 2 thick iron pillars on the cage were cut by his fingernails. It was enough for his body to squeeze into the cage. This time was a little later than he expected. He quickly drilled into the cage and put his hand on the entrance password of the freezer storage. When his fingerprints passed through the authentication hole, the freezer storage that had been silent for a long time in the dark church's branch suddenly lit up. If someone saw this scene, they would definitely think that they had seen a miracle. Iris verification. A mechanical female voice came from the freezer storage. Dudian immediately put on the eyeball. This was the second password. If it was only the fingerprint, then there was a possibility of being copied. But if it was the iris, then it would be very difficult. Chapter 234. Dean couldn't wait to look inside when the door opened. He saw that everything was the same as when he closed the door. Especially the mattress where he was sleeping was still piled up with garbage from the garbage dump. Now it had long been rotten and dried up, exuding a burst of unpleasant smell. He didn't care about the garbage, and quickly pressed a button on the wall. The inner mezzanine poured out with a click. There were 3 energy tubes inside. Only the bottom of the energy tube at the end had a little light blue luster. It was extremely beautiful, like precipitated plasma. Dean quickly took out the energy tube and removed the chip reader. At this time, his face suddenly changed. He quickly closed the freezer, turned around and drilled out of the cage. He didn't look back as he ran to the outer edge of the hall. The green mist here was relatively indifferent. There were other alchemists and potioneers lying on the ground. Only a few of the hundreds of people in the hall had escaped. Dean hid the energy tube and the chip reader in his robe and slowly climbed to the ground at the outer edge of the hall. At this time, he sensed a smell coming straight towards him. Dean immediately lay down on the ground and pretended to be unconscious. After a moment, a team of well-equipped dark knights came to the center of the square outside the hall. They saw the green mist floating in the air around them. Their faces were very ugly. They were led by a young woman and a middle-aged man. They looked at each other. The middle-aged man said in a low voice, "You stay here. Don't let the people inside escape. There is only one passage." After saying that, he raised his hand and waved. 2 dark knights stepped out from the group and followed behind him into the poisonous fog. The middle-aged man and the 2 dark knights had obviously taken the antidote long ago. They rushed to the hall at full speed with their weapons in hand. The first thing they saw was the divine item in the cage. When they saw that the cage was destroyed, but the divine item was still there, they heaved a sigh of relief. They then looked around the hall and saw that all the people in the hall were unconscious. Those who had the antidote had already run out of the hall, not wanting to get involved in such a battle. The middle-aged man's eyes were cold as he glanced at the people lying on the ground who had fainted. His eyes were cold as he gestured to the 2 dark knights behind him. The 2 dark knights understood. One of them immediately turned around and retreated. A moment later, he returned to the periphery of the poisonous mist and reported to the young woman, "Captain, the divine item from the previous era is still here. Captain Simon is guarding it inside." The young lady heaved a sigh of relief. She then turned to the dozen or so dark knights behind her and shouted, "Team 1, guard the outer perimeter. Team 2, take the antidote immediately and enter inside to investigate one by one. The assailant is likely to be among these unconscious people. If you see anyone carrying weapons or strange objects, arrest him immediately and await punishment." "Yes." The 2 squads of dark knights behind her immediately obeyed her orders and moved swiftly. The young woman looked around and said to a dark knight, "Let the patrol team send people to control the poisonous gas immediately. Also, let them evacuate the others. Don't cause unnecessary casualties." "Yes." The dark knight acknowledged, then turned and left. At this time, the team of dark knights who had already taken the antidote lined up and entered the poisonous gas like a carpet. They turned over the unconscious people on the ground one by one and checked their clothes one by one to see if there were any strange objects hidden in them. The young woman crossed her arms and looked at them coldly. Suddenly, boom! A violent explosion sounded from the ground above them. It was like thunder on the flat ground. It was actually weakened by the layers of soil and the secret passage, but it still had a dull penetrating power. The young woman was shocked. She couldn't help but look back. Her face was full of surprise. The middle-aged man standing in the hall also heard the muffled sound coming from afar. He was startled and shocked. This sound seemed to come from the manor above. It was so far away, but there was such a terrible sound? What happened up there? Did the assailant escape to the top? The middle-aged man looked back at the cage and the divine item from the previous era. He gritted his teeth and said to the Dark Knight, "You stay here and watch. I'll go out and have a look. If anything happens, immediately inform Captain Aisha." After saying that, he immediately rushed out of the hall and came to the young woman who had set up a defensive circle outside the poisonous gas. She asked, "What happened?" Aisha said in surprise, "There's a big movement outside." Did the assailant escape with the crowd? Simon's expression changed. He said, "That's impossible. We came very fast." The assailant fought with the guards in the hall and also used a special method to destroy the cage. During this time, there was no way for him to run out of the hall and rush into the crowd outside. Aisha said, "But you said the divine item from the previous era is still there. Could it be that he knew it would be difficult to completely destroy the cage and take away the divine item, so he only destroyed half of the cage and ran away with the crowd?" Simon's expression changed. He thought of the damage marks on the cage. Indeed, if the assailant spent a lot of effort to destroy 2 small iron pillars, it would indeed take several times more time to destroy the entire iron pillar of the cage. His eyes flashed. He said, "I'll go and have a look. Maybe it's his companion. You continue to guard here." After saying that, he immediately rushed out. Aisha's eyes were full of worry as she looked at his back. Dean, who was lying in the hall, slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the Dark Knight who was standing in front of the cage. His eyes were cold. The moment he turned his head to the other side, his figure jumped up from the ground and rushed over. The Dark Knight's reaction wasn't slow. He felt the movement and immediately turned back. He saw Dean rushing over. His pupils shrank. He quickly waved his sword to resist and opened his mouth to shout. Whoosh! Dean swung his arm and a dagger pierced into his mouth, interrupting his scream. As the Dark Knight retreated in pain, Dean rushed forward like a black panther. His palm fiercely pressed the handle of the dagger in the Dark Knight's mouth. Puff! The dagger pierced through the back of the Dark Knight's head. The Dark Knight's body stiffened. His eyes were filled with pain. Dean pulled out the dagger. He didn't look at the soft body of the Dark Knight. He turned around and rushed out of the green mist. His eyes were full of killing intent. Soon, his figure rushed out of the green mist. His footsteps were so light that they couldn't be heard. His figure was reflected in the eyes of the Dark Knights. The Dark Knights, who were focused on searching the unconscious on the ground, were a little slow to react. Their first thought was that the assailant had appeared. Their second thought was to attack and protect themselves. By the time they held their weapons and were ready to respond, Dean had already rushed in front of one of them. Such a fierce momentum made the Dark Knight's heart tremble. Although ordinary Dark Knights had the strength of primary hunters, they didn't have the murderous aura of hunters. "I can't beat him." From Dean's momentum and speed, the Dark Knight's brain immediately helped him to make a judgment. But he knew that he couldn't retreat, so he clenched his teeth and stabbed his sword at Dean's head. The moment Dean approached, he suddenly turned his body. The bloody dagger in his hand suddenly pierced through the Dark Knight's chin. Then he didn't stop and ran out of the green mist with the dagger. When Aisha heard the movement inside, she was shocked. She didn't expect that the assailant was still lurking inside. What kind of courage did he have? She quickly pulled out the sword from her waist and stared at the green mist. She knew that the person who dared to break in here to snatch the treasures was definitely not an ordinary character. Whoosh! Dean broke out of the green mist. The indifferent green mist didn't hinder his sight. He had already seen the young woman and a team of Dark Knights behind her. From their positions, there was no doubt who was the strong one inside. Chapter 235. Seeing Dean rushing towards her, Aisha's eyes showed a dignified look. She held her sword tightly. When Dean stepped into her attack range, she suddenly shook her wrist and quickly cut the sword diagonally, displaying her best swordsmanship. Dean saw the movement of her wrist, and expected that she would attack from the upper body. His body suddenly bent down, and at the same time, his waist and back exerted force, turned around and kicked towards her lower abdomen. Aisha's face slightly changed. She hurriedly retracted her sword and staggered back. She narrowly escaped Dean's kick. She didn't expect that she would fall into a disadvantageous position. She stared at the eyes behind the mask. She felt that the eyes were dark and indifferent. Even in such a situation, they still revealed an extremely cold calmness. She slightly gritted her teeth and said, "No matter who you are, you dare to kill innocent people and rob the treasure of the previous era. Don't think about leaving here today." Dean was about to continue to attack, but suddenly his heart moved. He said in a hoarse voice, "Kill innocent people? You people of the Dark Church dare to call yourself innocent? Don't think about delaying time. Get out of here." He raised his dagger and quickly slashed towards Aisha's cheek. Aisha's face turned ugly. She hurriedly waved her sword to resist. Clang! 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 The sword parried all of Dean's daggers. Dean frowned. He didn't expect this woman to be so difficult to deal with in close combat. Moreover, her physique was a bit stronger than his. She should barely reach the physique of a senior hunter. But in actual combat, she couldn't be compared with a senior hunter. Otherwise, he would be defeated in 2 or 3 moves. He smelled the smell outside and gathered more and more. There was a trace of urgency in his heart. He suddenly stabbed the dagger towards Aisha's chest. Aisha retreated while waving her sword to resist. She knew that as long as she delayed this person and waited for the support of others, she would be able to capture him. Dean's dagger stabbed out. When Aisha waved her sword to resist, the dagger suddenly retracted. It was a feint attack. At the same time, he lifted his foot and kicked towards Aisha's knee. Aisha's face slightly changed. She hurriedly retreated. Dean continued to attack with the dagger. Aisha once again waved her sword to resist. However, this time it was still a feint attack. She immediately retracted her sword and kicked out at the same time. Aisha was prepared and immediately dodged. At the same time as she dodged, Dudian suddenly threw out the dagger that was retracted halfway. With a swoosh, it shot towards him. Aisha was shocked. Her body reacted instinctively, and she quickly tilted her head to avoid it. However, she was still slashed by the dagger, and a cut appeared on her beautiful cheek. Blood seeped out from the wound. Dean took advantage of this opportunity and quickly bypassed her, running toward the passage outside. The team of Dark Knights in the encirclement were shocked to see that their captain was injured. They immediately gathered together when they saw Dean rushing towards them. They didn't intervene in the battle between Dean and Aisha because they were worried that they would hinder Aisha. After all, Dean didn't have any scruples when attacking them. Aisha was worried that she would accidentally hurt them. Dean's eyes were cold as he looked at the Dark Knights that had gathered together. He was like an angry beast that was about to collide head-on. The Dark Knights were shocked. They didn't expect that Dean would dare to rush towards them unarmed. They didn't want to take the initiative to attack. They just wanted to stop Dean. Dean rushed to the middle of the Dark Knights. He looked at one of the Dark Knights who was about to stab him with a sword. He immediately moved to one side to avoid the attack. At the same time, he grabbed the wrist of the Dark Knight. His 5 fingers fiercely twisted. The pain made the Dark Knight loosen his hand. The sword fell out of his hand. Dean also loosened his hand and quickly grabbed the sword. His body rotated to avoid 3 stabs from the side. At the same time, he waved the sword in his hand. Puff, puff. The neck of the young Dark Knight who had his sword snatched away was cut open. His eyes widened as his body stiffened and he fell to the ground. The other Dark Knight on the left was also stabbed in the face. He screamed and covered his face with his hands. Dean's physical strength was at the intermediate level before he was imprisoned. Moreover, his physical strength was slightly higher than that of ordinary intermediate hunters. The evolution of magic marks had brought about a transformation in his physical strength. His physical strength was almost comparable to that of an ordinary senior hunter. Although his close combat skills were poor, but it was still worse than that of a senior hunter. However, he was only slightly inferior to these Dark Knights. He could rely on his huge physical strength to make up for it and easily crush them. Dean quickly waved his left hand after seizing the sword. He swung the swords of several Dark Knights that were attacking him. The heavy strength of the sword shocked the Dark Knights. Dean broke through the encirclement. He didn't wait for Aisha to catch up with him. He quickly ran towards the passage in front of him. Soon he saw a large number of figures crowded at the outer edge of the square. There were also guards patrolling the square. From the moment he released the poison until now, it had only been less than 3 to 4 minutes. In the midst of the panic, the people in the square dispersed even more slowly. For a moment they blocked the passageway. Under the protection of the guards, they slowly entered one by one. Dean threw away the sword when he broke through the encirclement of the dark knights. He didn't want to drag his speed. When he came to the passage, he saw several patrolling guards had noticed him. He immediately shouted, "The poisonous gas is coming! Run!" Although he was shouting, his voice was still very low. It was particularly harsh to the ears. The guards who were pacifying the crowd were shocked when they heard this. Some of them wanted to look back to see if it was true or not. But as soon as they turned back, they were pushed by the people behind them. They couldn't stand stably and fell on top of others. Then they fell down like dominoes. "Stop! You are the attacker!" The guards immediately pulled out their weapons as they saw Dean rushing towards them. Although they didn't witness it, but they could see the clues from Dean's speed. Moreover, the crowd in the square had evacuated to the front of the passage. Dean ran out of the encirclement of the Dark Knights. His identity was obvious. Dean had already inquired and observed the combat power of these guards. They were inferior to the Dark Knights. They could only be regarded as trainee Dark Knights. He snorted and rushed forward without the slightest pause. The guards were incomparably shocked and furious. They roared and rushed over. Dean quickly got close to several guards. The speed of the swords was very slow in his eyes. His figure flashed and he easily dodged. He raised his fist and hit the cheek of the guard in front of him. Bang! The guard was sent flying. He didn't entangle with the other guards. He went straight to the passage at full speed. Chapter 236. Dean's speed didn't slow down, and he quickly rushed to the back of the crowd. Looking at the crowd in front of him, he didn't hesitate to step on the back of the person in front of him. Using the person's back as a stepping stone, he continued to run forward. Along the way, the crowded figures were either trampled or crushed by Dean. The scene suddenly became chaotic. Aisha, who was chasing from behind, was stunned. She thought that Dean would be stopped by the crowded passage. She didn't expect him to completely ignore the lives of these people and rush out at all costs. Damn it! Aisha clenched her fists and gritted her teeth as she watched Dean trample on the crowd. Dean could do this, but she couldn't. As the captain of the Dark Knights appointed by the Dark Church, she was assigned to this branch of the Dark Church to protect the people here from the attack of the Holy Church. Moreover, in this crowded crowd, it was difficult to guarantee that there wouldn't be a star-class believer or even a master. If they were trampled to death by her, she couldn't bear the responsibility alone. "Get out of the way! Get out of the way!" Aisha raised her hand and pushed the flustered crowd in front of her. Although she couldn't trample on the crowd violently like Dean, she wouldn't stop. She squeezed from the back of the crowd, and at the same time let the guards next to her assist her to evacuate the crowd. While she was struggling to open the way, Dean had climbed to the front of the crowd. He jumped down and pushed the people in front of him to the ground, making a gap for him to stand. Then he quickly jumped over them and ran to the exit of the passage, which was the hall of the castle. At the moment, there were a large number of people standing in the hall, all wearing masks. Many of them were standing in front of the castle, pointing at the outside and talking. Dean squeezed into the crowd and jumped out of the other side of the window without looking back. He jumped to the grass outside the castle and looked back at the darkness behind him. He saw a large number of people gathered in front of a horse shed outside the manor, where his carriage was parked. Dean no longer looked at it. He quickly lowered his head and ran along the route he had previously observed. The castle was surrounded by a high wall, but in front of his inhuman jumping ability, it was useless. When he came to the front of the wall, he immediately saw the patrolling guards. These guards also noticed Dean, and they shouted and sprinted toward him. Dean did not pay attention to him. He jumped over the wall and landed on the street outside. The surroundings were secluded and there was no one around. He quickly ran along a path and left the manor in the blink of an eye. He ran all the way to the wilderness outside the town. Although there were wild beasts in the wilderness at night, he didn't have to worry about them at all. An hour after the attack on the branch of the dark church, the anesthetic fog in the plaza had already been dispersed by the potioneering apothecaries that had been dispatched. The unconscious people on the ground had also been given the antidote, and most of them had regained consciousness. However, some of the people who had been standing closer to the poisonous fog had ingested more of the anesthetic fog, causing their hearts to go numb and stop beating. Inside the hall, Aisha and Simon stood with their hands by their side. There was another person standing beside them. The pattern on his armor was the same as theirs, indicating that he was of the same level. In front of the three of them stood a figure that emitted a terrifying aura. His bones were extremely thick, and his entire body was covered in a black robe. He was nearly 2 meters tall and looked extremely imposing. His black hood covered most of his face, revealing thin lips that were as cold as daggers. At this moment, this mighty figure was facing the cage, seeming to be inspecting the divine object of the last era within it, and also seeming to be sizing up the 2 iron pillars on the cage that had been cut off. Amidst the deathly silence, he slowly said, "Do all of you know what will happen to all of you if this thing is taken away?" The faces of the three of them changed. Their bodies slightly trembled as they bowed their heads. Aisha slightly gritted her teeth. "It's my dereliction of duty. Commander, please punish me." The imposing figure didn't make a sound. After a few minutes, he slowly said, "According to what you said, the enemy isn't a single person, but the number isn't too many. Otherwise they wouldn't have sent only one person to steal. Immediately go and find out where this paralyzing fog came from. The other party was able to sneak in. It is very likely that they are people from the Dark Church. You must thoroughly investigate." "Yes." Simon immediately agreed. Aisha hesitated. "Commander, there is something I don't know if I should say it or not." The stalwart figure turned around and glanced at her. Aisha bowed her head. "When I was fighting with the attacker, I said that he was killing innocent people." His response was, "You people of the Dark Church are also qualified to call yourselves innocent." Listening to his tone, it seems that he is very hostile towards the Dark Church. I think that he is someone sent by the Holy Church. Simon and the other youth were startled as they heard this. Their complexion fluctuated. The imposing figure was silent for a moment. He slowly said, "Even if the Knight of Holy Church wants to punish us, they won't use poison. It goes against their dogma. The purpose of the other party should be to mislead us. A person who can invade the Dark Church's branch and then leave calmly. How can he waste unnecessary time in a fight with you? He is an extremely cunning guy. Moreover, it proves that he is a member of the Dark Church." Aisha was startled. Simon and the youth also revealed a look of realization. "Go and search immediately. Before dawn, I need you to hand over something valuable, not a pile of trash. Go." The stalwart figure ordered coldly. Aisha, Simon and the youth immediately turned around and left. "Bren." The imposing figure suddenly spoke, calling out to the youth, saying, "When we were being invaded, what were you doing?" The youth's complexion changed. His body suddenly overflowed with cold sweat. He trembled as he replying to the commander. "I was drinking," the imposing figure indifferently said. "If such a thing happens again, your tongue and the thing between your legs will become seasonings for your wine." The youth's complexion turned pale. "I won't dare to do it again. Go." The imposing figure indifferently said. Time ticked by. 5 hours after the end of the attack, Aisha, Simon, and Bren hastily returned to the main hall. When Aisha saw the imposing figure still standing in front of the cage, she hastily said, "Commander, I found the source of the paralyzing poisonous fog. A potion apothecary's shop sold this thing today. Moreover, the quantity was huge. According to the shop's lady boss, the quantity of poisonous fog that appeared in the main hall was about the same as the quantity she sold. The attacker was the one who bought it from her." Chapter 237. Aisha hesitated. This person bought it anonymously. Moreover, he didn't use the church's points for the transaction. He traded in private currency. The lady boss doesn't know his code name. However, I have checked the number of the gold coins he traded. The number on the side wheel came from the same currency bank. After investigation, it was found that the Melon Consortium was behind it. The Melon Consortium? The imposing figure was startled. He was silent for a moment. "I will send people to investigate the Melon Consortium. You go to the Blaze family and see what their reaction is." At the side, Simon glanced at him and said in a low voice, "Commander, the Blaze family has been living in a low profile for many years. This matter shouldn't be their doing, right? Although the source of the explosion that covered the attacker's escape came from the Blaze family's flame explosion forbidden art, this forbidden art is one of the simpler ones. Most financial groups know the recipe and the military produces it in batches. It is often used in wars in the radiation zones. If the Blaze family came to steal the divine artifact of the previous era, they would have used another method to cover it, right?" The imposing figure looked at him. "I know that you have received grace from the Blaze family. But remember your current identity. Anyone who dares to go against the Dark Church is our enemy. Although the Blaze family is usually low-key, but the Sleeping Tiger is the most dangerous. No one is willing to be dull and lonely. They are just waiting for a new opportunity to rise. Do you really think that everyone in their family can see through worldly power and wealth?" Simon's complexion slightly changed. He didn't dare to say more. "It is because the consortiums and the military know about the flame explosion forbidden technique that the Blaze family can make excuses. I want you to go and ask them to pay attention to their reaction." The imposing figure indifferently said, "The easier it is to be suspected, the less likely it is to be the mastermind. But this is just our normal thinking. They can also use this in turn." Simon bowed his head. "I know. Go. I also need to appease those old fellows. This incident has shocked those old bones. The sooner we find out the identity of the attacker, the lighter your punishment will be," the stalwart figure said. Simon, Aisha and Bren's complexion slightly changed. They immediately left. Night. In the wilderness outside the town. The gray clouds that were like stagnant water tried their best to block the moonlight, but there was still a faint glimmer that penetrated the clouds and shone on the flowers and grass in the wilderness. Occasionally, the howls of wild beasts could be heard in the distance, full of sorrow and loneliness. Dean's figure rapidly moved forward in the moonlight. He came to a concave slope in the wilderness. He smelled that there were no pursuers behind him, so he stopped. He fell on the grassy slope next to him, gasping for breath. He let the sharp needles prick his neck, but he was powerless to care. Fortunately, the time is just right. Dean was secretly glad that the explosives in the carriage would detonate. He had connected the purple leaf to the fuse of the gunpowder before returning to the carriage. He had relied on the slow burning speed of the purple leaf as a timer. After many experiments, he had mastered the burning speed of the purple leaf. But after all, the flame was difficult to control. He couldn't tolerate even the slightest error. Fortunately, there were no accidents. Otherwise his life would be in the Dark Church's branch. This was a risk and a bet, and the energy tube of the freezer was worth the risk. However, what really gave him the courage was the flaws that he found during the exploration. Probably the indestructible cage protection had given the Dark Church a reassurance. The ordinary Dark Knights were responsible for the supervision and protection of the guards. The senior Dark Knights were relatively free. They were busy with their own things or enjoying life. This led to them being defeated by the perfect defense. The enemy's strength was their weakness. This was a truth that Dean had long understood when he was hunting outside the giant wall. It had helped him many times to avert danger and turn defeat into victory. If I become a senior hunter, then the chances of success will be greater. In the entire outer wall, a senior hunter is the top combat power. Only the top professionally trained punishers can capture a senior hunter. Dudian thought in his heart. Although the strategy was good, but if the strength was enough, it could save a lot of risk and brain power. He couldn't help but hope that his left hand could recover as soon as possible. The next time he went outside the giant wall, he would be able to use the cold crystals that he had collected. But it would take time to absorb them. He couldn't use too much at once. Touching the energy tube and the chip reader under the robe, Dean could not help but feel nervous in his heart. The remaining energy inside was enough for him to learn how to use electricity and a lot of other knowledge. Once he learned how to make generators, the knowledge inside the chip would be inexhaustible, and he would no longer have to worry about energy exhaustion. At that time, it would be the beginning of his real business. After a short rest, the cold wind blew. Dean's thoughts gradually calmed down. He took off his robe and mask and followed the route back to the Ryan castle. Although it was dark at the moment and soldiers had been sent to patrol the town, but the ordinary patrols were meaningless in front of an intermediate hunter like him. He could easily avoid them. Dean returned to the yard town late at night. At the moment the lights were off and the streets were dark. He didn't directly enter the Ryan castle but rested in the wilderness outside the town. The next morning, Dean woke up. He patted the withered leaves and flowers on his body and went back to the Ryan castle. Old Foulin was eating upstairs. There was a smile on his face as he saw Dean. "I heard from the coachman that you went to the Red River town? Although you are a hunter and have a strong body, but the women there are not clean enough. It is better to go to the Moulin Rouge in Lido. That is the best place." Dudian indifferently said, "You can go if you can." Old Foulin laughed. "No man will admit that he can't do it no matter how old he is." Dudian didn't continue to entangle with him on this issue. Last week, the Melon Consortium built a large market in Pinetown. During this time, our yard town's business has been bleak, right? Old Foulin sighed as he saw that Dean was talking about business. "Yes, the textile factory can't receive any orders. The rich businessmen read the newspaper every day. They know that we have a grudge with the Melon Consortium. They don't want to offend them, so they don't dare to give us orders. We were able to get orders because of the efficiency of the new textile machine. Now the new textile machine is something that every household has. The textile factory can only sew some things and sell them in the town." Dudian nodded slightly. Since the sale of the abandoned mine, the main income of the Ryan family had come from the tax revenue of the yard town. Melon Consortium had chosen to build a big bazaar in such a remote neighboring town. The purpose of the bazaar was to take away the business of the shops in the town. As a result, the taxes collected by the Ryan family would rapidly decline. Even some shops would be forced to move out of the yard town. In the long run, this place would become a desolate town where no one would visit. "They are warning us. They want us to bow our heads and take the initiative to follow them." Dean could feel the intention of the move. His eyes flashed with coldness as he looked at Old Foulin. "How do you want to deal with this matter?" Old Foulin smiled. "I wanted to ask the Scott Consortium for help, but they refused. The Melon Consortium transferred funds to open a market in this remote place. They are too lazy to fight with the Melon Consortium in such a small place. We can only rely on ourselves to find a way. Fortunately, there are dividends from the new textile machine. Even if the taxes are reduced, we can bear it in the short term." Chapter 238. For the Scott Consortium, we are just a small consortium. Most of our savings have been invested in the lease of the giant wall. Moreover, we have offended the Melon Consortium. In the future, we can only rely on the Scott Consortium. Naturally, they don't take us too seriously. Dudian indifferently said. His years in prison had made him have a deeper and more intuitive view of things. Old Foulin bitterly said, even so, in addition to your identity as a hunter, you are also a rookie inventor. In the future, you will create more benefits than a hunter. But they don't value this point. They are too short-sighted. Dudian pulled out a chair and sat on the table. It's not short-sighted. There are other considerations. They have already signed a contract with the new textile machine. In the future, it will be difficult to continue to improve it. Although I have invented this thing, but I haven't made any other achievements. In the eyes of others, it's just luck that I am favored by the goddess. Old Foulin sighed. We can only wait for your arm to recover. If the dividends from the new textile machine are enough, then we will use our connections to buy the fountain of life from the Holy Church to treat your arm. Dudian looked at him and nodded slightly. His eyes swept to the newspapers on the table. He grabbed one and asked, Is there any news today? As usual, there is no big news related to us. Dudian read the newspapers one by one. He didn't see any news about the attack on the Dark Church's branch last night. Most of it was suppressed by the Dark Church's branch. After all, they couldn't see the light of day. The only report was that there was a strange noise in the town where the Dark Church's branch was located. It was suspected that there was a beast invasion and so on. Dudian paid attention to the source of the news agency that reported the article. He asked the servant to bring his breakfast and quickly finished it. He said to Old Foulin, I need to rest for the next few days. Don't let anyone disturb me if there is nothing important. Well, that includes you. Old Foulin was surprised. Don't worry. I won't disturb you. Take good care of yourself. I'll ask the kitchen to make some supplements for you. Dudian nodded. He got up and went back to his room. After closing the door, Dean took off his coat and took out the energy tube hidden under his left armpit. Previously, his left hand was injured, so the energy tube was not prominent under his thick clothes. In addition to the energy tube, there was a palm-sized chip reader hidden in the inner pocket of his coat. There was a faint smile on Dudien's face as he looked at the two things that almost cost him his life. He squatted in front of the wardrobe and opened the bottom drawer. There were some thin clothes and jewelry boxes inside. He opened the innermost jewelry box. There were a few gold and silver coins inside. There was also a chip. It was the super chip. Before going to prison, Dean had hidden the super chip in an unknown place. It was in the corner of the courtyard of the house allocated to him by the Melon Consortium. The reason was that he was worried that a thief would sneak into his house and break the safe to steal it. Later he was imprisoned and the house was taken back by the Melon Consortium. Jura and Dudien's luggage were thrown out of the house. Only the super chip was still hidden there. The last time he assassinated Deacon Huey, he took the time to go back and dig out the super chip. A cunning rabbit has 3 burrows. I'll have to prepare a few more secret places in the future. Dudian opened the card slot behind the card reader and inserted the chip. Then he plugged the card reader into one of the jacks above the energy pipe. There were 6 jacks, all circular holes around the top. There was a rectangular groove in the middle. It was aimed at the connection plug inside the freezer. Dudian took a deep breath and clicked open. The screen of the card reader suddenly lit up and showed the background picture. Bouron Castle, Mount Erdos. Rudolph was eating breakfast in the spacious dining room as he read the daily newspaper. He looked at the butler next to him. How is Miss? Is she eating on time? The middle-aged butler respectfully replied, Miss has been on a hunger strike since the last time you promised her. She ate everything that was sent to her every day. Moreover, she has been actively studying the law of the magistrate. She said that she will return to the magistrate in a few days. Rudolph nodded. Let the magistrate take care of her. Don't let her take dangerous cases. I will. The butler nodded. How is the market in Pinetown? Rudolph asked again. The housekeeper said, "Everything is in the budget. In a few days we will open for business. Currently, the publicity is in place. These few days, there are a lot of businessmen entering Pine Cone Town. Moreover, several chambers of commerce have already found the person in charge there to cooperate with them. Pine Cone Town is included in their caravan route. I heard that the rent for the shops there has increased by several times." Rudolph nodded. "Don't let Miss know about this. I don't want any more trouble." The butler glanced at him and hesitated for a moment before saying, "Master, Miss has finally agreed to never see that brat again. This matter has already passed, so there's no need to pay attention to that brat anymore, right?" Rudolph indifferently pointed to the breakfast in front of him. "Look at this dessert. It's bright and exquisite. It's appetizing. Would you eat it if there was a dead fly on it?" The butler's face slightly changed. He knew that he had angered Rudolph. He understood the meaning of Rudolph's words. Even if the fly didn't eat the dessert, its presence was annoying. "She's not young." Rudolph looked out of the window. "Last time I missed the marriage with the Milan family. Later that bastard was sent to prison. It's not a pity. I hope that in my lifetime I can lead the Bourong family to return to the inner wall and fulfill my father's last wish. I also want to see the scenery of the inner wall." The butler looked at Rudolph's rigid face. He sighed but didn't say anything. Time flew by. Since the news of Dean's arm injury spread out, the Ryan family had returned to the usual quiet life. They were running their own small businesses and eating and drinking frugally. The other clansmen who had tasted a little bit of nourishing life were not used to it. This kind of discomfort was getting more and more unbearable under the catalysis of time. Moreover, it was difficult to control. Chapter 239. Hearing the girl's words, the sound of the knives touching the plates and chewing suddenly stopped. Everyone's eyes coincidentally looked at Dean. These words had been in their hearts for a long time. Especially when they saw these bland dishes every day, the dissatisfaction in their hearts was unbearable. "Nonsense!" Old Fouline's face sank as he shouted. Seeing that he was angry, the girl bit her lower lip and lowered her head. Jake, who was sitting next to Duddian, said, "Father, don't be angry. The child is not sensible. Mr. Dean, don't blame her. We are waiting for your body to recover soon." Duddian smiled but didn't say anything. There was a trace of disappointment in Jake's eyes as he saw Dudien's indifferent reaction. He looked at his father's angry face and then looked at Sanders' calm face. He resisted the urge to ask. The atmosphere of lunch was a bit dull because of this episode. Duddian went back to his room and locked the door as usual. A few days passed. On this day, Duddian accompanied old Fouline to have breakfast in the small dining room upstairs. "I'm going to report today. I don't know if there is an accommodation there. You don't have to wait for me for dinner." Old Fouline looked at him and sighed. "These kids have made a fool of themselves. They are not sensible. Don't lower yourself to their level. You should take some time to recuperate. Although you don't need to fight there, but it should be very hard." Duddian smiled. "I'm almost recovered. It's time to move." He got up and took out the coat from the hanger. He said goodbye to old Fouline and left the small dining room. He walked down the wooden steps and saw Houghton and several other young people in the hall. The girl who was dissatisfied with him a few days ago was among them. They were eating and chatting. "Morning." Duddian casually said hello to them as he passed by. They looked at Duddian but didn't say anything. Only Houghton squeezed out a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Dean. Are you going out?" Duddian nodded. "I'm going to the Temple of Elements." Temple of Elements? Houghton and the others were stunned when they heard these words. Their eyes lit up as they got up from the table. "Mr. Dean, are you going to the Temple of Elements to report?" Dean asked. "Is Mr. Dean going to the Temple of Elements?" Dean smiled. "I'm not going to drink tea." Houghton was happy. If Mr. Dean joins the Temple of Elements, then we won't have to worry about the New World Consortium if he can make a few friends and get some magic items from them. A young girl beside him said in surprise, "Then I won't have to worry about my new dress anymore." The girl who was previously dissatisfied with Dean was also full of joy. She looked at Dean and gave him an encouraging look. Dudian said goodbye to them and left the castle. He sat in the carriage and went to the Temple of Elements. The Temple of Elements was different from the Magistrate and the Holy Church. There were no branches in the headquarters. All the inventors were gathered there. They could communicate with each other and enlighten each other. It was a holy place for learning. Many alchemists and potions masters yearned for such a peaceful and stable learning environment. They joined the Temple of Elements and joined the Temple of Elements. The Temple of Elements was located in the northern part of the commercial district. It was close to the direction of the inner wall. It was located on the Drudge Mountain. The name of the mountain meant God. The Drudge Mountain was extremely high. There were a large number of orchards on the hillside. There were several small towns around the foot of the mountain. All of these towns were the fiefdoms of the nobles under the Holy Church. Knights of Light could be seen everywhere. Every town had a holy church to spread their faith. Dean sat in the carriage for 5 hours. He finally arrived in front of the Drudge Mountain. He got off the carriage and looked up. He could see the green hillsides full of orchards. He told the coachman to go back first. He came to the front of the mountain and saw 8 Knights of Light stationed there. They had cold expressions under their bright silver helmets. They were coldly looking at Dean. "Stop." One of the knights stopped Dean. "Please show your identity." Dean took out the invitation letter. "I'm a new member. I came to report today." The young knight looked at him and picked up the letter. He recognized the badge on the letter and nodded. "Go." Dudian took back the letter and went up the mountain road. After walking for about 100 meters, he met a team of patrolling knights who checked his identity medal. He could only hand out the invitation letter again. After passing the inspection of the team of patrolling knights, he walked another 100 meters and met another patrol team. He had to hand out the invitation letter again. At the same time, he also saw that the defense here was very strict. Insects couldn't fly in. The defense on the surface was amazing. There were many masters who were secretly protecting him. There were definitely some top powerhouses. Even if a senior hunter came here, it would be difficult to protect him. After all, the Temple of Elements was an important tributary of the Holy Church. The losses would be too heavy if they were to be wiped out. After a moment, Dean came to the manor at the top of the mountain. He saw a very majestic castle standing at the top. It was the Temple of Elements. "Who are you?" "Stop." The guard in front of the manor shouted as he saw Dean. Dean didn't say much as he directly handed out the invitation letter. The guard took a look at the letter to confirm that it was genuine. He handed back the letter. "Please wait a moment. I'll help you inform them." He signaled to the guard next to him. The guard immediately turned and entered the castle. He came out after more than 10 minutes. At the same time, a middle-aged figure came out with him. It was Carrie who went to invite Dean last time. "Mr. Dean." Carrie saw Dean from far outside the manor. He carefully identified him for a moment. There was a bit of surprise on his face. "You finally came. Please come in," Dean said. There was a delay in the middle. "Is there any impact?" No, Carrie enthusiastically said. "Our Temple of Elements is always open to young architects like you. Although you didn't come, but your name has already spread in the Temple of Elements. Your new textile machine work is very creative. It not only completely changed the efficiency of the textile machine, but also opened up a new era. Many masters have been inspired by your work and have gained a lot." Chapter 240. You have joined the Temple of Elements. We will award you the medal we owe you. Carrie laughed. "It's very difficult to get a medal in the Temple of Elements. especially the epoch metal, which is one of the highest specifications. Many architects struggle for their whole life, but it's difficult to get this metal. You haven't joined us, so we can't award it to you. Please forgive us. There is a medal? Dean was slightly surprised, but he didn't care. He chatted for a while and followed Carrie into the Temple of Element. Within the spacious hall, the walls were filled with the highest grade of lamp oil, burning with a light fragrance that refreshed one's heart. There were a few tea tables placed in the corner of the hall, and there were a few figures sitting there, flipping through books in their hands and sipping tea at the same time, looking very relaxed. Come. Carrie took Dean to an office on the side of the hall. There were 7 or 8 desks and more than a dozen figures were sitting there. The desks were full of documents and they were busy. I'll register your information, Carrie said as he sat down on one of the empty desks. He took out a few forms and contracts and handed them to Dean. Dean knew that his position in the Temple of Elements was similar to Peter's position in the scavenger headquarters. He was responsible for personnel management. He took the contract and looked at it. The content was similar to what Carrie had told him. He would be given a castle with a generous monthly salary. He would be able to freely enter the major libraries. Even some libraries in the commercial district that were open to the nobles could be entered for free by virtue of his identity medal. It could be said that, except for the fact that they were not aristocrats, all aspects of life were at the same level as aristocrat. Of course, this was only the lowest level of aristocrat. Only when they reached the senior architect level would they be able to get fiefs, collect taxes, build farms, and become landlords. I'm an intermediate architect? Dean was surprised to see the contract. Carrie laughed. Although you have just joined the Temple of Elements, your new textile machine proved your talent. So you were specially approved to be an intermediate architect. If you were to join the Temple of Elements and invent a new textile machine, then you would be directly promoted to an architect. Your status would be higher than an ordinary aristocrat. Dean understood. There will be a severe punishment if I don't complete the monthly task. What is the punishment? There will be a deduction of some points, Carrie said. You will get points for completing the task. If you don't complete the task, then you will be deducted double the point. So although you are an intermediate architect, but if you don't work hard in the future, then you will be demoted to a primary architect. Although we won't take back the castle, but the other continuous rewards will be reduced, such as your salary. Dudian was surprised. It was similar to the system of the Dark Church. The Temple of Elements and the Dark Church did exactly the same thing. It was like a legal version of the Dark Church. Did the Holy Church realize the benefits and charm of the Dark Church during the long war with the Dark Church? So they copied the same and legal institution under the jurisdiction of the faith? He put away these thoughts and read the contract again. After confirming that there was no word game, he signed his name. Once the contract was signed, it would take effect and be managed by the magistrate. Even if the staff of the Holy Church violated the law, they would still be sanctioned by the magistrate. However, the Holy Church would be the judge before the sanction. This was the coexistence method that the Holy Church and the magistrate had found after many fierce conflicts in the long history. Carrie smiled as he saw Dean sign the contract. Welcome to join us. After this contract is submitted, your identity medal will be produced. It will be sent to your hand in 3 to 5 days. This is your temporary identity certificate. Now I can take you to choose your castle. Dudian nodded. A castle was worth a few gold coins, but it wasn't something that could be built with money. Only the aristocracy had the right to build a castle. So rich businessmen who wanted to live in a castle had to pay double the price to ask the aristocracy to help build the castle and then buy it from them. But some of the upper-class aristocrats were very resistant to such a thing. After all, in the long history, the castle was almost the exclusive symbol of the aristocracy. If such a thing was rampant, then there would be castles everywhere in the future, and they wouldn't be able to show their noble identity. but there was no way to stop the other aristocrats from chasing after benefit. So the Holy Church was able to directly reward an intermediate architect with a castle. He followed Carrie to another room. There was a huge sand table that was more than 10 meters in size. It depicted the appearance of the entire commercial district. There are green marks on it. You can choose the castle, Carrie said. Dudyan was amazed in his heart. He had long wanted a map of the commercial district and even the entire giant wall. But there was no such thing for sale outside. He didn't expect to see a complete sand table here. He saw a large piece of the sand table in the center. It was the commercial zone of the entire commercial district. It was divided into 4 districts. More than 70% of the economy and more than half of the population of the commercial district were concentrated here. The outer edge of the commercial zone was the open wilderness. There were small towns and villages scattered here and there. There was a long black line outside the small towns and villages. It was a miniaturized city wall. It was the border fortress. As for the outside of the fortress, it wasn't included in the sand table. In the vicinity of Yardtown, there are 7 or 8 small towns the size of a palm. Dean quickly found the location of the Ryan Castle. The area of the Yardtown was like a small peanut on the sand table. According to such a proportion, it was conceivable that the commercial zone in the middle was a few meters in diameter. The area was huge and prosperous. He repeatedly looked at the sand table. This was a rare opportunity. If he could memorize the map, then it would be a lot easier in the future. While recording, his eyes also swept to some green-marked castles. There were dozens of them. He was a little surprised. He saw the unfathomable capital of the Holy Church. This one is good. Wait, let me see. Dean pointed to the castle marked with green color. He wanted to choose but hesitated. His eyes were scanning the entire sand table. He wanted to use more time to memorize the castle. Time passed. The smile on Carrie's face was somewhat stiff. He thought that it could be done quickly, but he didn't expect that Dean would take 2 or 3 hours to choose. Although he suspected that Dean was taking the opportunity to look at the whole sand table, but from time to time Dean would choose and then give up, so he quickly dispelled this idea. He thought of Dean's origin. He was just an adopted poor orphan. It was rare for him to have the opportunity to get his own castle in the commercial district, so it was understandable that he was so cautious. This one. Dean pointed to an old castle that was located by the river. Carrie's numb eyes regained some vigor as he said, "This one? Yes. You don't want to think about it anymore." "No." "Have you decided?" "Yes." "Really decided?" "Yes." Carrie saw that Dean didn't give up halfway. He picked up the green flag and said, "I'll help you with the check-in procedures. From now on, this castle is yours. The ownership is 50 years. It can't be sold or passed on." "Yes." Dean nodded. Carrie immediately took Dean to go through the procedures. After a moment, all the procedures were completed. Carrie's numb spirit recovered a bit. He said, "I'll take you to your workshop." He took the lead out of the room and went to the hall. At this time, the hall was several times more than before. They were gathered in front of the wall of the hall. Carrie noticed the commotion and was surprised. He looked at Dean. "It seems that there is a good task. Let's go and have a look." Dean looked up. Although he was far away, he immediately saw the place where the crowd was gathered. It was a bulletin board. There were more than a dozen notices posted on it. The content was strange. Recruiting at a high price. 5 primary water element oracles. 5 primary wood element oracles. Carrie came to the back of the crowd and looked at the contents on the bulletin board. He murmured in surprise, "Master Terence is recruiting. Could it be that he has found the way to make the hydraulic loom?" Dean was curious. How did the water element come about? Carrie looked back at him and explained. The research of the Temple of Elements is divided into 9 major schools. Metal element, wood element, water element, fire element, earth element, wind element, lightning element, light element and dark element. Metal element refers to all kinds of metals. Whether it is precious metal or base metal, all of them are within the research scope of metal element. Wood element refers to the research of plants and trees. Carpentry is also a part of wood element research. Your new textile machine belongs to the field of wood element. Dean was startled. He didn't think that the classification of the Temple of Elements was more detailed than that of the Dark Church. From a scientific point of view, the 9 major research schools included almost all the matter in the universe, including the 4 basic physical forces. Lightning element could be included in the research of lightning element. Your metal is the metal of wood element, Carrie said to Dean. If you have new achievements in other fields of elements, then we will give you a new medal. But it is recommended to specialize in one field so as not to lose your way. I will. Dean nodded. Speaking of which, if you are interested, you can also take this reward and participate in Master Terrence's research. After the completion of the research, you will get the corresponding points as reward, Carrie said in an excited tone. If you are new here, then you can join other research teams. It will help you to quickly familiarize yourself with our place. Dean looked at another inconspicuous notice. The paper of this notice was yellowed and worn, but the content made his eyes slightly cold, but his expression was as usual. You are right, this reward hasn't expired yet. Can I receive it? Carrie followed his gaze and was immediately stunned. He said in astonishment, You want to take this? This is the lightning element faction. Dean nodded. Carrie was speechless when he saw his confirmation. Didn't they agree to specialize in one area? Why did he change his mind the moment he agreed? I suggest that you don't want to take it, Carrie patiently advised. The lightning element is too dangerous, and it's easy to lose one's life. This bounty has been posted here for a few years, and people have accepted it, but all of them failed. 2 of them even lost their lives due to carelessness. You should change to something else. Dean was enlightened. No wonder the recruitment didn't mention the faction requirements. Carrie smiled. The number of people in the lightning element faction is small. Who would dare to ask for a faction? But in the long run the weak will only get weaker. Dean said, I want to try. Chapter 241. Carrie was speechless as he heard Dean's reason. The weakness of a faction is determined by the environment. Your talent is wood element. Why bother to step into a field that you are not good at? How do you know that I am not good at it if I haven't tried? Dean asked. Carrie looked at his serious expression and felt a little depressed in his heart. He thought to himself, You were able to develop a new type of textile machine only because your father was a tailor. The lightning element has nothing to do with life, and it's difficult to even get started. However, he naturally wouldn't say these words out loud as it would offend people. He could only say, Well, if you can't do it, then it's not too late to get out. Dean nodded and immediately wrote down the place assigned by the bounty notice. I'll take you to see your God's room first, Carrie said in a weak tone. Dean followed him. The 2 of them left the castle and went to the back of Mount Degia. This was a hillside that rose and fell like the spine of a dragon. Behind the main castle were individual castles that looked at each other from afar. Carrie explained along the way. The primary God's room is outside, the intermediate ones are in the middle, and the masters are in the deepest part. The environment is quiet and far away from disturbances. You can devote yourself to the God of Light's teachings. You are an intermediate God's disciple, so you can get a separate God's room. If you are a primary God's disciple, then you need to share a God's room with others. So you must cherish it. Dudian heard the implied warning in his words. He knew that he was still trying to persuade him to accept the reward. Dudian knew that he had good intentions, but he had his own plans, so he didn't say much. After a moment, the 2 arrived in front of the 6th castle. Carrie said, This is your place. There are accommodation and God's room. You can move your daily necessities here. You can tell the servants if you need anything. As for research materials, you can buy them from the temple's material warehouse. Of course, you can also use gold coins, but it's not cost-effective unless you have a lot of money. The area of the castle was relatively large. There were several farms and orchards inside the walls. There were servants carrying slaughtered birds. The castle was extremely spacious. There were several buildings. Some were specialized accommodation, some were God's room for research, and some were places for study and relaxation. Along the way, the servants who saw Carrie nodded in greeting. Carrie took Dean into a towering building. The first floor was empty and the light was dim. At the moment, a thin youth was standing on a panel in the corner. He was brushing rice milk. There was a piece of white paper on the panel. It was a reward for materials. The youth noticed Carrie and Dean coming in. He raised his eyebrows. Did someone get promoted again? This is the third one this month, right? Carrie recognized him and said with a smile, "There are more and more smart people nowadays. If you don't work hard, you'll be overtaken by the younger generation." The youth snorted, and his eyes fell on Dean. After looking up and down for a moment, a trace of surprise flashed in his eyes. "So young? She's a few years younger than me, right?" Carrie laughed. "Don't talk about you. Mr. Dean is the third youngest architect in the entire Temple of Element. He is only 2 years older than the little monster from the 5th castle." 2 years older? The youth looked up and down at Dean. He felt the vitality of a teenager. He sighed. "Another newcomer with good potential. Maybe in a few years he will climb ahead of me." Carrie laughed. "That's why I told you to work hard. You don't want to bow to a junior who has entered the temple later than you, right?" The youth smiled and extended his hand to Dudian. "Hello, my name is Bernard." Dean. Dean also extended his hand and shook it. Bernard was stunned for a moment. His eyes widened as he said, "Dean? Are you the creator of the new textile machine, Dean?" Dean touched his nose. "If it's Dean who created the new textile machine, then it should be me." Bernard was stunned for 2 seconds as he heard Dean's witty answer. His eyes lit up as he said in surprise, "I've heard about your deeds for a long time. At such a young age, you have created an epic-making textile machine. Gee, this is the pride of our wood element. I was wondering why there was such a young newcomer. It turned out to be you. Haha, I didn't expect to learn from you." Dean smiled but didn't know how to answer. Carrie laughed. "Don't be happy too early. You are also a wood element. Be careful not to be overtaken by Dean." It's normal to be overtaken. Bernard didn't care. Carrie was speechless. He rolled his eyes and said, "You lack the fighting spirit. That's why you are here." Bourne snappily said, "I don't lack fighting spirit, what I lack is money. Who told me to come from a poor family? Other people use a lot of materials for their experiments. I have to be careful and frugal. It's not easy for me to become an intermediate architect. Sigh, I should find a noble to earn some extra money. Nobles nowadays are too smart." Speaking up to here, Bourne's face showed a bit of sadness. Carrie understood his situation. He didn't say anything more. He looked at Dean. "I'll take you to your room." "I'll go too." Bernard immediately picked up the rice milk bucket and said. The three of them went upstairs together. Carrie said as they came to the 4th floor, "This is your room. If you want to change it, you need to apply to the top." Then he entered the corridor. Dean and Bernard followed behind. There were 4 spacious rooms on this floor. Each of them was a separate God's tool room. There were some basic God's tools used for research. That is, experimental equipment. This is the room. Carrie took out the key and opened the door of the 2nd room. They saw that it was extremely spacious. It was about hundreds of square meters. There were several sawing tables and some small tools. If you lack any god relics, then you can apply to the top or go to the temple to buy them," Carrie said. "In addition to the monthly tasks, the other things you make will be included in the temple for sales evaluation. You will get a corresponding commission from the points you sell. Dean's eyes lit up. Is my new textile machine the same? Carey shook his head. You have signed a contract with the Scott Consortium. We can't get involved. Dean was a bit regretful, but he expected it. He glanced at the room and thought of several things. One of them happened to be what he urgently needed. He secretly noted it down in his heart. Hey, newcomers? At this time, an old man passed by the door. He was surprised to see Dudian and the other two in the room. Chapter 242. Carey turned around and said with a smile, "It's Mr. Henson. Are you going out?" "I'm going out to find some materials." The old man glanced at Bernard and Dean in the room. He knew Bernard, but Dean was a new face. He was surprised. "Is this a newcomer who has just been promoted? So young?" Carey laughed. "I forgot to introduce him to you. This is Mr. Dean, who recently won the Epoch Medal. He is also the maker of the new textile machine." Henson was startled. The gentle smile on his face slowly disappeared. He frowned. "Him? If I remember correctly, the new textile machine has been around for a long time. Why did you invite him now?" Carey immediately explained. "We invited him a long time ago. But Mr. Dean was busy, so he didn't respond. Today he came to officially join the Temple of Element." Henson understood. He looked at Dean and said in a slightly persuasive tone, "I heard that you live in a tailor's family. Your father is an excellent textile worker. The new textile machine was invented by your father when he was sewing. Your talent is good, but don't be arrogant. The mysteries of the world of divinity are as deep as the sea. Only by studying hard can you have achievements. Don't waste your talent." Dean slightly frowned but didn't say anything. Henson said to Carey, "I'm going to find the materials. I won't bother you." Then he left the room. Carey looked at Dean after Henson left. "I hope you don't mind him. The old man is being kind." Dean shook his head. "Let's go. I'm going to get the reward. It would be a pity if someone else took it." Carey saw that Dean was still thinking about the reward. He smiled. "All right." He took the lead and went out. Bernard was surprised as he heard Dudien's words. "What bounty? Do you need more people? Can I go too?" Carey replied, "You don't need to participate. Dean wants the reward for the lightning element. It's Ivisa's reward." Bernard was stunned. He looked at Dean, who was walking in front of him. "Ivisa's reward for the lightning element? Dean, aren't you a wood elemental? Do you want to transfer to the thunder elemental faction?" "Let's expand our knowledge first," Dudien said. Bernard was stunned. He smiled bitterly. "What's there to see? Lightning element faction is full of lunatic. It's too dangerous. I can't even avoid it. But you still want to see it. It's really..." Dean looked as usual and didn't explain anything. Soon, the three of them went down the wooden ladder and arrived outside the building. Bernard stopped and said, "I still have something to do, so I won't be able to follow you. See you later." Then he took his rice milk bottle and went back. Dean and Carey continued to go back along the original road. They soon met the previous old man. Carey said, "We'll go first. Take care." Hai Song nodded slightly and glanced at the two of them without saying anything. After returning to the outside of the castle, Carey and Dean went straight to the depths of the hillside. They stopped in front of the 12th castle. "It's here. Let's go in." Dean looked up at the castle and followed behind him. The guards at the door recognized Carey, so they didn't stop him. Carey went straight to the hall after they entered the castle. He said to Dudien, "Ivisa is a master of the Temple of Elements. Each master has a separate castle with an independent environment. They won't be disturbed by the outside world. If you had joined the Temple of Elements, then you would have been able to get the title of Master by relying on the new textile machine." Dean faintly smiled but didn't reply. The reason why the Temple of Elements didn't give him the title of Master for the new textile machine was that the contract for the new textile machine was sold to the Scott Consortium. The actual income they got was very low. Secondly, they thought that this was their pinnacle work and it would be difficult to surpass it. Naturally, they would save as much as they could. After all, the resources enjoyed by a master was extremely terrifying. Carrie came to the hall and said to the guard, "Inform them that I want to see Master Ivissa. Please wait a moment." A guard turned and went into the hall. After a moment, the guard returned and said to Carrie, "Please." Carrie was the first to enter. He saw that the hall on the first floor was extremely spacious, and the decorations were appropriate. Several maids were standing around the hall, and one of them, a young girl dressed slightly different from the other maids, stepped forward and said, "Please, the master is waiting for you upstairs." She turned around and led the way. He came to the study room on the second floor. Dudien heard two hearty laughter as Carrie pushed the door open. He saw two figures sitting on the sofa. One of them was a middle-aged man dressed casually. The other one was a 70-year-old man with a white beard. They were talking about something. And were laughing. Carrie was surprised when he saw the middle-aged man. Master Terence? Dean vaguely felt familiar when he heard the name. He remembered that the person was the one who had issued the reward for the hydraulic loom. He looked at the person. "Little Carrie?" The old man looked back at Carrie. "What are you doing here? Is it because I'm going to be promoted?" Carrie smiled as he heard Terence's joke. "Greetings, masters. Let me introduce you. This is Mr. Dean. He is the maker of the new textile machine. We came here because Mr. Dean wants to receive the reward task from Master Ivissa." The smile on old man Ivissa's face disappeared. Terence, who was next to him, was also startled. His eyes flashed with a sharp light as he looked at Dean from head to toe. Terence frowned as he didn't feel the slightest awe from Dean's eyes. There was an inexplicable feeling in Dean's eyes. If he had to describe Dean's eyes, then it would be like a prey caught in a net. It made his heart uncomfortable. Dean's eyes touched Terence's but immediately moved away. He looked at old man Ivissa. "Greetings, master. I want to take the task you have issued. I want to look for bioelectricity." Old man Ivissa looked at him from head to toe. "Although the reward is generous, but the requirements are not low. Have you learned any inventions before?" "No." Dean nodded. Old man Ivissa shook his head. "That's a pity. Although any faction can receive it, but my requirement is that you must master some simple knowledge of inventions. I'm sorry that you can't meet my requirement." Dean slightly frowned. "I can learn. I can definitely provide you with help." "No need." Old man Ivissa shook his head. "This task has been hanging for a long time. I should consider withdrawing it. As for you, you are able to make a new textile machine. It shows that you have some talent. I hope that you can study the path of wood element. Don't be greedy for small benefits and delay your important matters. The future is very long and you are still young. You have to calm down and learn well." Dean looked at Ivissa's expression. He saw that Ivissa had made up his mind. He frowned and sighed. "Well, I know. Old Ivissa is right." At this time, Terence also said, "Occasional luck won't last long. Only by mastering a deep foundation of inventions can you continue to grow in the future." Dean looked at him but didn't say anything. He looked at Carrie. "I'll go back first. Masters, goodbye." Then he turned and left. Carrie also looked at Ivissa and Terence. "Masters, I'll go back too. I'll send him off so that he won't get lost." Then he chased out of the castle. Terence frowned as he looked at Dean's back. A lucky person who is favored by the god of light is a civilian's son. He is short-sighted and doesn't know how to use the rare opportunities available to him. He should study hard and become a real good architect. Ivissa slowly shook his head and sighed. If his new textile machine came out a little later, then the epic medal might fall on your head. Although you have the idea of making a hydraulic loom, but it hasn't been completed. So you can't get an evaluation. Now you can only get a water wood medal. Terence's face sank. This was a sore spot in his heart. Well, let's not talk about these unhappy things. Ivissa saw his expression and immediately changed the topic. Chapter 243. Dudian left the castle and went back the way he came. Carrie caught up from behind. He looked at Dudien's expression and patted his shoulder. Don't be frustrated. Master Ivissa didn't accept you because he was afraid of delaying your talent. It's not a bad choice. If you concentrate on the wood element, then it's not impossible for you to recreate something comparable to the new textile machine in the future. Once you become a master, it's not too late to distract yourself and learn other things. Dudian knew his good intentions. What's the task for this month? Now it's half of the month. All the tasks will be issued at the beginning of the month. You won't be given any task for the rest of the month. You should take the time to study and strive to be competent for next month's task, Carrie said. Dudian nodded. This was also good. He could make the necessary weapons for hunting outside the giant wall. Now that he had the knowledge from the superchip, he wanted to make weapons to hunt monsters outside the giant wall as soon as possible. He wanted to upgrade his physique to the level of a senior hunter as soon as possible. He knew that it would take too long to practice his skills. He could only rely on his physique to make up for it. The purpose of joining the Temple of Elements was to use this identity as a cover to buy some materials that were difficult to buy. Now that you have joined the Temple of Elements, there will be a ceremony to award you the medal, Carrie said. After the ceremony is over, we will help you hold a banquet and invite all the nobles to come and participate. Those who have won the epic medal are famous masters in the 3 regions. You are the youngest person in the history of the epic medal. In the future, when you become a senior architect, the temple will focus on cultivating you. You can go to the inner wall to study. This is the right of a master. Go to the inner wall? Dudien's eyes moved. He was quite interested in the inner wall. After a moment, Dean and Carrie left the top of the Temple of Elements. They sat in a carriage and went to the castle that Dean had chosen. They were going to do the handover procedures. A few days passed in the blink of an eye. In the Ryan castle, old Foulin looked at the binoculars that Dudian handed over. Is this the one you improved? Dudian laughed. Try it. Old Foulin immediately grabbed the binoculars and looked out of the window. He was amazed. So far? I can see the faces of the pedestrians in the small town outside the hillside. Dudian smiled. The telescope was invented by the Temple of Elements shortly after the invention of the glass. The telescope had a long history of development and would never reach its limit. The famous Hubble telescope was able to observe the expansion of the universe. Some of the more advanced telescopes in the later generations could even see the other side of the universe. Gee, I didn't expect you to be able to improve other magic items after joining the temple for a few days. Old Foulin was amazed, but he had seen Dean's clever performance more than once, so he wasn't too shocked. If this thing is submitted to the temple, it should be able to sell a lot of points, right? It's all right. There's still a long way to go before I can buy the water of life, Dudian said. In fact, the production of the telescope was far more than an improved telescope. He had secretly made a more advanced telescope in his castle. It was close to completion. With his own vision of thousands of meters, he could see things within 10,000 meters. That is, 20 miles. Of course, he wouldn't be able to see things if they were obstructed by something. However, such a telescope was more than enough for the environment outside the giant wall. Dean didn't intend to submit the 10x telescope to the temple. Although the points he earned were enough to buy the Fountain of Life, but it would be too abrupt. In addition to the 10x telescope, he had already prepared another item to exchange for points. But it would take a few days to ferment so as not to arouse suspicion. It's your banquet tonight. I'll be there too. Old Foulin looked at Dudian. I didn't expect that your new textile machine would get the epic medal from the Temple of Elements. I heard that if you didn't sign the contract with the Scott Consortium, then you would get 10,000 gold coins. It's a good deal. It's much more than the dividends you get from the Scott Consortium. The Temple of Elements is worthy of being the property of the Holy Church. It's a big business. Dudian was surprised. More than the dividends from the Scott Consortium for the new textile machine? How much did they give? 3,000 gold coins for the first month. Old Foulin said. Dudian was startled. His face turned gloomy. Old Foulin's heart skipped a beat as he saw Dudian's expression. Is there a problem? If I remember correctly, you signed the contract with them 5 days ago, which is a month ago. You will receive your dividends, right? Dudian asked. At that time, he was busy with his research in the new castle. He didn't have the energy to care about these things. Yes. Old Foulin nodded. Haven't you checked the dividends? Dudian asked. Old Foulin knew the meaning behind Dudian's words. Are you saying that they falsified the accounts and embezzled our money? It's impossible. They shouldn't care about such a small amount of money. After all, we are a consortium and you are an architect. They are too stupid. Dudian said in a cold voice. I'm afraid it's not a small amount of money. If they have enough money, they would dare to pluck the hair off the head of a tiger. Moreover, we are at most a mouse in their eyes. Old Foulin was surprised. You mean the dividends are far more than that? Generally, the birth of a new product needs publicity and promotion. After a period of gestation, it will burst into resounding popularity and occupy the market. But the new textile machine is different, Dudian said. The original textile machine that everyone is familiar with has been improved. The results are remarkable. Anyone with a discerning eye can understand it. In other words, the profit earned in the first month is the best time. After the first 3 months, the funds will gradually stabilize and then slowly decline. With the status of the new textile machine, it can even enter the inner wall. It won't just circulate in the 3 districts. So, this amount of money isn't enough to fill the gap between the teeth. Old Foulin was stunned. Although he expected that the new textile machine would be very valuable and would have a great impact, but after all, it was something used by civilians. 3,000 gold coins was a lot for him after he split it with Scott Consortium. I'll go back and investigate this matter, Old Foulin said in a dignified tone. Dudian shook his head. I'm sure that they are greedy. The 10,000 gold coins given by the Temple of Elements is just a symbolic reward. I'll ask someone in the temple, and they will be able to estimate the market value of the new textile machine. Even if we only get 20% of the profits from the Scott Consortium, it will still be a huge amount of money. His eyes narrowed as he spoke. Chapter 244. Don't be impulsive. Old Foulin sighed as he saw Dudian's expression. He comforted him. We don't have any evidence in our hands. Even if we know that they have falsified the accounts, there is no way to get justice. Although you are an architect and your status is different from before, but the brighter your aura is, the more attention you will attract. Don't lose the big picture because of small things. We will slowly settle this account in the future. Dudian saw the worry in the old man's eyes. He gently raised his hand and patted the old man's shoulder. I will deal with this matter. Don't worry. People are fragile. Whether it is a senior hunter or an ordinary person, they are all fragile. It doesn't take a big axe to destroy a sophisticated machine. Sometimes a hair of dust can dismember it. Old Foulin looked at the deep darkness in Dudian's eyes. He felt that the temperature of the surrounding air had dropped a bit. There was an inexplicable tremor in his heart. It was as if the person standing in front of him wasn't a human teenager but a dark evil monster. Now, let's go to the banquet. Dudian's face suddenly showed a smile. His temperament was as gentle as spring breeze. Old Foulin was in a trance. He didn't have time to carefully investigate the previous feeling. He was reminded by Dudian's words. He immediately responded, Yes, it's getting late. Let's go to the banquet first. We will talk about this matter later. This banquet has invited all the aristocrats. It's a great opportunity for us to take the opportunity to win over other aristocrats. It's a rare time to gather contacts. Dudyan smiled and helped him to leave the room. Old Foulin told the butler outside to prepare the carriage. Both of them went to the venue of the banquet, St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg used to be a cathedral of the Holy Church. Later on, Church of Holy Church became the headquarters of the Temple of Element. St. Petersburg was the closest place to the Temple of Element. The sun gradually fell. The sky was dim and the stars were twinkling. Dozens of carriages were parked outside the manor in front of St. Petersburg. All of them were aristocrats from various places in the commercial district. They included various consortia. Whether it was the upper-class aristocrats or some aristocrats who wanted to rise up, they had come in person. After all, he was the person who won the epic medal from the Temple of Elements. Although some consortiums such as Scott and Mellon Consortium didn't care too much about him, but they didn't dare to ignore the epic medal from the Temple of Elements. The sky had just turned dark when the incense lamps were lit outside the manor. This was the highest level of incense oil, and it came from the bodies of golden beasts. Even in the castles of some high-class nobles, it was only used in dining rooms, study rooms, and bedrooms. Here, it was directly lit on the street lamps outside the manor. Even the guards on duty could feel their vitality being refreshed, and their exhaustion was swept away. Carrie and several other colleagues received the distinguished guests at the entrance. They exchanged greetings with each other. Carrie was an acquaintance of the noble circle and the Temple of Elements. He had a wide network of contacts. As soon as he saw two nobles enter, he saw a carriage coming from outside. His eyes lit up when he saw the flag on the carriage. "They're here." The carriage stopped. Dean helped Old Foulin out of the carriage. Old Foulin's son Sander followed behind them. They were like juniors waiting behind. "Mr. Dew," Carrie immediately came forward and laughed. "As the protagonist of tonight, you're a bit late." Dean shrugged. "Traffic jam." Carrie smiled and looked at Old Foulin. "This is the old patriarch. His body is still so healthy. You really picked up a treasure." "It's just luck." Old Foulin laughed. "Please come in. It's windy outside." Carrie immediately invited and led the way. The three of them entered the manor and came to St. Petersburg. The luxurious and heavy gate that could accommodate more than 10 people at the same time slowly opened, and golden light shone on the three of them. Laughter and chatter came from inside. The first thing that came into their sight was the extremely luxurious yet retro grand hall and the glass chandeliers that were so exquisite that they could be called works of art. Of course, it wasn't electricity inside but Sanskrit oil. "You go ahead, we'll take a walk," Dean said to him. Carrie laughed. "Well, there are a lot of people now. I'll go and greet them first. I'll accompany you later." Dean helped Old Foulin to come to the hall after Carrie left. There were several huge long tables filled with all kinds of fresh fruits, pastries and wine. Some aristocrats were standing together and chatting. They were covering their mouths and laughing in a low voice. Their manners showed aristocratic etiquette and cultivation. "I didn't expect that I would be lucky enough to come to St. Petersburg." Old Foulin sighed. "My father had come here once when he was young but he didn't bring me. But now I'm here in person because of you. It's really as luxurious as the rumors say. I think only the top craftsmen can build such a majestic castle." Dean smiled and picked up a few plates of pastries with low sugar content. He handed them to Old Foulin. "Eat something. We'll go and sit next to each other." "Okay." Old Foulin nodded and sat down on the sofa. He smiled at Dean. "You go and play by yourself. Don't accompany an old man like me. You're not young. It would be good if you can take this opportunity to hook up with a few aristocratic ladies." Dean helplessly looked at him. "I'm afraid that I won't be able to find one that matches my age." "No, 16 or 17 years old is a bit old, but it's not uncommon. It's rare to meet someone over 20 years old. Look over there. Old Foulin laughed. Dean glanced at the direction of his finger. There were several aristocratic ladies who were about 14 or 15 years old. They were chatting and laughing together. He looked at old Foulin. I'm going to walk around. You have a good rest. After he finished speaking, he walked to the center of the hall and wandered around. His eyes swept across the nobles who came to him. His sharp hearing allowed him to distinguish the low murmurs of their conversations. Although it was not a secret in such an occasion, he could still hear the things that these nobles liked to talk about and their interests. Bourong family. Dean's eyes fell on a middle-aged man. His calm expression suddenly turned gloomy. He was familiar with this man's face. Although he had only seen him once, but his face was firmly and deeply engraved in his heart. It was Jenny's father, Rudolph. At the moment, there were several aristocrats around Rudolph. They were chatting with him while holding bottles of wine. In such an occasion, wine was a good additive. It made greeting each other for the first time so that it wouldn't be too embarrassing. Little devil, don't look around. Pay attention to the road. Suddenly, a voice sounded from behind. Dean looked back and saw a fat middle-aged man with a few strands of white hair on his temples. He should be in his 50s. Dean was startled because the other person's appearance was vaguely familiar. He was startled for a moment and suddenly remembered that when he had just become a scavenger and attended the banquet of the Melon Consortium, he met the man at the door. After a few years, the appearance and figure of the other person had changed, so he didn't recognize him for a while. Mace? Dean looked up at him and whispered his name. He had only heard this name once, but it was deeply engraved in his heart. He also remembered the humiliation of bowing his head in front of the dignitaries. Well? The middle-aged man slightly raised his eyebrows. Do you know me? The coldness in Dean's eyes converged as he saw him admit it. He indifferently said, Your collar is good. I hope you can wear it for a long time. Then he turned and left. Chapter 245. Do Dean. As Dean passed by a long table, a soft and weak voice suddenly sounded, with a bit of timidity in it. Dean was a little surprised. He turned his head and saw a beautiful woman with beautiful hair like a waterfall. She was slender, wearing a light pink skirt. She was elegant and full of gentle temperament. Her eyes under the long eyelashes had a bit of shyness. He could not help but wonder, You are. It seemed that he had never seen this girl before. I am Ania. There was a trace of disappointment in the girl's eyes as she saw that Dean didn't recognize her. But she still took the initiative to introduce herself. There was a trace of embarrassment on her face. I'm from the Avril family. We met when you were young. When I was young. Dean was surprised. He suddenly remembered. Is that you? When he was adopted by Jura and her husband wanted to marry him into the Avril family. But fortunately, the other party was not satisfied with this blind date. He still remembered that in that cold, windy street, there was a beautiful girl whose voice was as sharp as a knife cutting his face. Her questioning made him realize the reality. From then on, he began to learn to adapt and become self-reliant. It's me. Ania's cheeks reddened. I didn't expect that you would become so handsome in a blink of an eye. Dean smiled. He didn't expect that the beautiful girl would be a slim and graceful beauty now. She should have just turned 20 years old. Her appearance was very different from before, but she was still as beautiful and moving as before. He didn't hate the girl when they separated. Instead, he was grateful to her. Now that they met again, his heart was filled with emotions and a touch of nostalgia. In the blink of an eye, he had been in this world for so long. Time passed in a hurry. Compared to the current living environment, the little girl's questions were so cute and pure. Unfortunately, he couldn't go back to that world. I hope you don't mind the things that happened in the past. Ania saw that he didn't speak for a long time. She bowed. We were young at that time. I was quite capricious and said some rude things. I hope you can forgive me. Dean smiled. It's all in the past. I want to thank you. If you had agreed to the marriage then I wouldn't be here today. Ania looked at Dudien's expression and saw that he wasn't being sarcastic. She was relieved. How can that be? Your talent is obvious to all. There are very few people who can get the epic medal from the Temple of Elements in the history of the Giant Wall. You are so young and yet you are able to get such a medal. Your future is limitless. Dean didn't feel happy after hearing her compliments. Instead, the faint aftertaste and nostalgia in his heart faded away. There was a bit of emptiness and regret in his heart. Some things in the past couldn't come back. The erosion of time and environment made everything unrecognizable. You flatter me, Dudien said. How have you been these years? Anya was slightly startled. She lowered her head and said, It's all right. As you know, our Avril family was in a slump back then. Our business hasn't improved, and we're only relying on the hotel to support us. Dean picked up a glass of juice and took a sip. He silently looked at her. Anya saw that Dean didn't answer her. She rolled her eyes. My business is boring. I'm curious about yours. Is it convenient to tell me how you became an architect? I heard that you are an intermediate hunter. My business is boring. Dean didn't intend to elaborate. He looked at her. If your family has any difficulties and I can help then I will consider one or two. Anaya was startled and her eyes lit up. She looked at him in surprise and said, Really? Dean nodded slightly. Ania said gratefully, Thank you for forgiving me for being young and ignorant. Thank you for forgiving me. If there's anything I can do for you, as long as you say it, I'm willing to do anything. At this point, a blush appeared on her face and her eyes revealed a hint of warmth. Dean sighed and indifferently said, No. I like your appearance when you were young. Although you spoke directly but you were still simple. Ania's eyes lit up. My current appearance has changed a bit but I won't be uglier than before, right? Dean looked at her and silently shook his head. Ania saw that his mood wasn't high. She reached out and pulled Dean's arm. Let's go over there and sit and talk. Dean pulled his arm out. You are married. It's easy to misunderstand if you are too close. It's not good for your family. Let's talk here. Ania slightly pouted. Don't think I'm too old. I'm not married yet. Although you were very young and I rejected you but you didn't get angry. I always felt that you were very mysterious. Later I found other men but I didn't like them so I didn't get married. She glanced at Dean with a bit of coquettishness in her eyes. Dean slightly wrinkled his brows. His nose was extremely sensitive. From the conversation just now he could vaguely smell a man's scent from her body. It showed that she absolutely lived with a man. Although the Avril family had declined, but after all they were nobles. Their children slept alone. It was impossible to squeeze in the bed with their parents and siblings. The smell could only be left by her husband or other men. Dean looked at her pouting and coquettish expression, but did not speak. From the beginning, she was coquettish, but now, in just a few words, she began to act coquettishly, which made him feel lost and regretful. Seeing her again might be better than not seeing her again. Seeing that he did not speak, Ania quickly paid attention to his expression. Seeing the young man slightly frowning, she immediately knew that she had used too much force. She quickly put away the charm in her eyes and changed the topic. I heard that you can also write poems. Can you write one for me? Dean looked at her for a moment and nodded. All right. He was about to recite a poem when he saw Carrie coming from outside. He immediately knew that almost all the guests had arrived. He immediately said to Ania, We will talk about the poem later. I still have things to do. Enjoy your meal. Then he left her and walked towards Carrie. Are you going to start? Yes. Carrie saw Dudien and looked at Ania. He smiled at Dudien. I didn't expect you to like this type of girl. Sorry to disturb you. Everyone is here. We can't let others wait for too long. let's get down to business. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.